Good morning and welcome to our work session. We have a long agenda in front of us, and to kick it off,
Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
Morning.
Today, obviously, we're here in a work session to talk about the 2020 budget. And so to kick it off, I wanted to just give some opening comments before I turn it over to staff as we kind of approach the budget. So this is my first budget. And so it's been interesting trying to get into the level of detail and the myriad of things that we do as a county government. Very, very important. As we approach this, and today's an information and sharing session to where we can get the feedback, I'll bring to you a recommendation based upon the feedback and the myriad of issues and ideas and thoughts regarding how we approach the 2020 budget at a later date. But we wanted to make sure we had that input as we develop and make some of those final recommendations. As we approach the 2020 budget, I think it's important that we think with our heart, but also with our head. And we're in a people business, and the decisions we make impact people's lives. We also recognize these are taxpayer dollars, and we need to be prudent and thoughtful as we look at both the short-term issues and the long-term impact regarding our overall budget. Those are not easy to do, and there'll be decisions we have to make because we simply can't afford everything. And so that's the type of balance that we need to develop as we're approaching the budget. So today we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about our capital improvement program. We're going to talk about our user fees and utility rates. And we're going to talk about our decision packages, both in terms of specific programs and requests, and also in terms of trends and the impact that may have as we kind of look, but we make decisions for today, but we plan for the future. So I think if we look at it that way, we'll have a balanced approach. We'll have good feedback and input to where we can bring back to you something that reflects your values and your priorities as we approach the 2020 budget. So with that, I'll kick it off. Turn it over to Bill or Jackie, and we'll begin. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Jackie.
I'm Jackie Trainer with the Office of Management and Budget, and I'm going to do the CIP Budget Information Session. And start out with our agenda. Just give you an overview of the capital improvement program. We'll look at the fiscal year 20 proposed budget. We'll talk a little bit about our project portfolio management that we've implemented, and then we'll look at the penny forecast. The capital improvement program is a 6-year plan. It's updated annually with the budget. The first year is the adopted budget, so fiscal year 20 is the only year that is actually the adopted budget, and it has to be balanced. The out years are a plan. And one of the things that we look at, and as Barry was talking about this, when we look at doing a capital improvement program, we need to look at the ultimate maintenance and operating impacts that might have. So in other words, if we build it, can we maintain it? So we look at the operating impacts. The CIP policies, they're intended to identify and balance the capital needs of our community based upon the fiscal capabilities and the limitations of the county. It's necessary to achieve the levels of service identified in the comprehensive plan, and it's aligned with the county's strategic plan. Some of the CIP objectives are to preserve and improve the infrastructure of our county facilities through public facility construction and rehabilitation, maximize the useful life of capital investments by scheduling those renovations and replacements at the appropriate time in the life cycle of the facility, identify current and future infrastructure needs, and establish priorities among those projects so that available resources are used to the community's best advantage. And again, we're looking at that limited funding, lots of needs. Improve financial planning by comparing needs with resources, estimating those future borrowing needs, and identifying fiscal implications. The fiscal year proposed budget for the enterprise funds is $138.3 million. This is just projects. This is not reserves. The enterprise funds are airport water, sewer, solid waste. And as most of you know, the enterprise funds operate much like a business in that their fees support their services and operations. The airport also receives a lot of grant funding, and for fiscal year 20, it's almost 50% of their proposed capital budget. All of these funds are balanced for fiscal year 20. There are really no issues. However, we did want to point out that for the sewer fund, we may need to consider borrowing to another year based on the pace of the projects that we're considering. But the rate study will help with that, but we may still need to look at borrowing in a future year. Each of these capital plans will be submitted along with your proposed budget in July. The proposed budget for the governmental funds is $211.9 million for fiscal year 20. Again, this doesn't include reserves. You can see the penny is our biggest funding source on the governmental side. It's basically 70% of our governmental projects. We also have the local option fuel tax that funds our intelligent transportation system projects. The tourist development tax funds our beach nourishment projects, and of course we get grants to leverage all of those. And we'll go into further detail on the specific penny plan a little bit later.
May I ask her, how do you want us to ask our questions as we think of them, or do you?
I think we should ask questions as we go, since this is part of the presentation, if it's specific to this.
Yeah.
Can I ask her to clarify something, please? Thank you. Jackie, what was the percentage you said the penny, it's 7%?
70.
70. Okay, 70%. And then what is the percentage of the tourist development tax?
This one is 12.4%. This particular year, though, is not just beach nourishment. That is also the Blue Jays Stadium work.
It's the what?
The Blue Jays Stadium from the tourist development tax.
Okay,
Part of that is in fiscal year 20.
all right, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So the next slide shows by function where those projects are. So basically, where does the funding go? And here you can see that transportation is our biggest percentage. It's at 36%. Some examples of these functions, because I know function is kind of a accounting term, but physical environment, that's where your flood control projects are, your drainage projects, also the beach nourishment projects. Economic environment, that's our Star Center projects. General government facilities, and human services is where your land assembly fund is for the affordable housing. What is not shown here is the penny 4 countywide set aside of economic development capital projects and housing, and they're not shown here because they could be many different functions depending on the project. It could be a transportation project, it could be a drainage project, could be a housing project. They are shown on the penny forecast that we provided, but they're just not shown here by function. So I just wanted to point that out.
So what's included in the culture and recreation?
Parks, preserves, libraries, that sort of thing.
We're spending $35 million next year. Wow.
Yes, I'm trying to think of some of the big projects next year.
Is
Is that Gulf Boulevard?
it what?
Gulf Boulevard.
Oh, that'd be in there.
That shouldn't be in.
Where is
Gulf
it?
Boulevards and transportation.
Transportation. Okay.
Yeah. I'd have to
Or
get,
maybe
yeah.
some of the,
trying to think of some of the big projects.
some of the
for-
TDC,
Yeah.
Ruth Eckerd and such.
The TDC?
We
Well,
can
maybe-
get-
Here comes Bill with
Yeah,
detail.
Bill has one of them.
We're going to look this up, but I'm pretty
Okay, I'm just-
certain
yeah.
that the capital, tourist development capital projects like the aquarium and the Blue Jays Stadium
Okay.
are what's driving a majority of that 35.6 million. that you
Just
see.
wanted to make sure.
Really nice snack stand down at 47.
You're right.
All right. So again, this goes back to the many projects and limited funding. And we really came into this realization of don't always have enough money for all the projects that we have. And when we were preparing for the Penny 4 referendum and we were getting all these requests from the community and the commissioners and our departments, we had to take a step back and say, we need a better way to look at these projects and prioritize. And that's really true for any funding source, whether it's utilities or airport or solid waste or penny. there's always a limited amount of funding for those project needs. And so we came together to get a management system to look at those projects, review them, coordinate them, prioritize them. And that's when we implemented project portfolio management. So I'll touch on a few of the key elements that we talked about at the May 2nd work session, just kind of high level on portfolio management. It's really been an enterprise-wide effort to bring together our department's prioritization processes. Not just that, but to coordinate across our departments so we are, just like the slide says, we're doing the right projects and we're doing the projects right. And we're doing that without overextending the county's resources. The focus is, again, on prioritization, coordination, project management, and delivery, and really that balance that's needed to meet all the community's needs. This is basically the entire process for portfolio management. We start out with the program prioritization, which is within the departments. Each department has a needs database that could be driven from the long-range transportation plan, watershed management plans, master plans. So they develop a prioritized list, and that's what we refer to as program prioritization. Each department's process could be a little bit different depending on the type of project. For example, we know resurfacing goes by the Pavement Management Index. Sidewalks have a prioritized list. Facilities have a prioritized list based on the renovation and replacement. Eventually, our enterprise asset management system will help us to forecast and prioritize our renovation and replacement. So the departments then submit their project requests through our CIP centralized SharePoint site. Those requests are evaluated on a common set of criteria that's based on our strategic plan. The criteria help us to prioritize, but they're not the be-all, end-all, because there's much more involved with analyzing a project request or balancing the needs of the community. So something that ranks low may not just be tossed out, and something that ranks high is a slam dunk. There takes more analysis than that. The project requests then go through a staff review committee, and that's to ensure consensus on the ranking and the prioritization and to develop this county prioritized list. From the county prioritized list, we allocate those resources and budget to develop our draft CIP plan. And once that's been done, the draft plan is submitted to county administration before it comes to you for review and approval, and that's where we're at now. So giving you a chance to look at that, and then it goes with the proposed budget in July. Each year we have an updated CIP 6-year work plan that's adopted as part of the proposed budget, and then we manage, we report, we deliver those projects, and that entire process is our portfolio management, or the way I look at it is we're managing our portfolio of projects. So that'll take us into the penny. And really, portfolio management helped us get to where we are today to be able to present a balanced fiscal year 20 budget, as fiscal year 20 is the beginning of penny 4. And I wanted to look back over the past 2 years where we came from. May of 2017, the board came up with their priority categories and projects. Then in November of 2017, the referendum was passed by 83%, which really is a testimony to decisions made by the board, administration, and the projects delivered by county staff. Last year, during the fiscal year 19 budget process in June, we put in some advanced funding, which included projects that were reprioritized from penny 3 to penny 4 for construction. Some of you may recall how those projects weren't going to move into construction yet, so we moved them out to penny 4. Some of the program projects were included, such as the resurfacing and the sidewalks. And then we also had some advanced funding requests for critical projects. Then this year, we've been working on the overall penny plan. And in July, we'll be including that with the proposed budget. The penny plan was included in your backup, and we're going to focus on the 6-year plan. which is 20 through 25. The fund is balanced in fiscal year 20, which again is the adopted budget, and it must be balanced and appropriated. The out years are a plan. However, by the end of FY '21, we are not balanced. And so we'll have to go through this again next year. We have some strategies that we're going to talk about with staff on how to balance that. One of the ideas we've had is on these recurring projects or bucket projects, program projects, is rather than just give them an allocation across the board, is to budget them each year, maybe 2 to 3 years at a time based on their actual needs and what needs to be done, what can be done. So, rather than do facilities at $10 million a year, it might be $8 million one year, $6 million the next year, $10 million the next. So, but we'll have time to talk about that with staff and resolve that imbalance before we get to
Question.
21.
Going back a few slides, you had said, you don't need to go back, but you had said something about that first year is going to be an approved plan, and then the subsequent 4 years or 5 years of that CIP will be just a plan. How do we start to help our partners understand how solidly each of those years going out is or isn't? Because it can't just be a plan that during the first year, all of a sudden, what we were talking about 2 years from now goes away. People are going to be planning their programs around that. So how do we look at that 6-year or 5-year period in a kind of a descending order of probability, I guess, as you go out? So how do you deal with that and communicate it to our? That's kind of two things.
Well, what we do is we try to be very transparent about that. When it changes, we do track that, any kind of change and why that has changed. So for example, if we have something in the plan right now for those 6 years in 21, 22, 23, and something changes based on funding limitations or priorities of the board or the community, whatever the needs are, we would have to document that and communicate that. So even though it's not adopted, it's not the adopted year, we do document if it gets pushed out.
But we will be approving a capital plan.
A 6-year plan.
A 6-year plan. So the thinking behind it is that those things are kind of thought through by staff and approved by the commission. So we're kind of moving in that direction.
Right.
So
It's our plan.
and typically, aside from funding restrictions, because that was what affected Penny 3 dramatically, I'd just like to get a better feel, not this morning, the thinking process as to how that all of a sudden somebody might say, oh, wait a minute, I was on the plan and now I'm not. And just some of that thinking as we go along. So that would be helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner, I mean, just kind of listening to that, I concur with that. That's something that we'll take to heart. Somebody that sees that they're out on something 3 years out and they're planning, we should have a compelling reason to
Right.
change from that. So if funding goes down, then that's a compelling reason. But they should be able to plan for that, absent some
Yeah.
major change. I hear your concern.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that, following up what Jackie was saying on 2 points. One is that communicating and being transparent. We're not going to be making decisions that are impacting other stakeholders without having them engage in that conversation. So that's a conversation that we have with them. That's a partnership that we have with them. And any changes we may make to what we have planned is going to be in partnership with them.
Yeah.
The other piece is that that's part of the strategy that Jackie mentioned when she talked about these recurring projects that don't have specificity associated with them in those out years. That planning those more than a couple of years out doesn't provide value to us because it sets an expectation around a dollar amount that A, we, at this point, based on the forecast, can't afford, and B, we don't have specificity that we've communicated with our stakeholders anyway. So that's the benefit of looking at those as a strategy as opposed to the other things that are more specific.
Yeah, I think that's so important, the first comment you made, because we have had bad relationships with our cities and partners in the past, perhaps, and have really worked hard to right that ship. So communication on that front is going to be so, and deliberation and working together and collaboration and all that's going to be important. Thank you, appreciate it.
And so this you know, we need to be able to adapt to those changing needs of the community. And so what you received in your backup packets, that is our recommendation today. The entire CIP, including the penny plan, will be part of the proposed budget in July. We don't really need decisions today, but changes can be made between the proposed and the adopted. And the next slide just shows the budget cycle. Again, the capital improvement program is part of that budget cycle. It'll come to you with the proposed budget in July and then be part of the adopted budget in September. And with that, if there are any other questions.
Madam Chair. Just a bit of a follow-up to the conversation that Commissioner Eggers started. Do you know when we are coming back for our high-level philosophical discussion about where we're going and the amount of dollars that we have consistently put into our partners, whether it's the nonprofit agencies or it's the municipalities, trying to shore up what legally and statutorily is the responsibility of the state and or the feds, but because they are not stepping up, we are.
Are you looking specifically at the capital projects? Or are
Well-
you talking about operational?
It's about everything, quite frankly, because I think we have to have, I mean, I know we have a process and we're coming back with another discussion to have a philosophical discussion. Barry and I talked about it just a little bit this morning. But it seems to me that as we're moving about in our days and staying up at night worrying about this stuff, we really need to have that discussion sooner rather than later, before we have to make these decisions about where our heart and our minds and our money is.
We're going to talk a little bit about that in the operational side when we get to decision packages, because then we can see the trends and where our spending is going. So we'll get into that a little bit more. I'm not sure how much it impacts on the capital side, but
Do we have a date, though?
that's a
where-
great question.
Do we have a plan to have that discussion? Because,
Well, we're actually going to talk about it today at the decision, when we get into the decision package
oh, the
piece.
date, you mean?
Today.
Oh, today.
Today.
Oh, well, I must have missed that chapter. I'm so sorry.
So we're going to introduce the topic and at the next piece.
I apologize. Please excuse
At
me.
least as an introduction.
Thank you.
Let me,
Oh,
Commissioner
yeah.
Justice, Commissioner Welch, and then Commissioner Eggers, and then Commissioner Gerard. Oh, did you have your hand up? Not yet. Okay. Sorry, I saw something flash into the right.
It was probably me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How does we've been having a discussion, and I know that we're coming back with a process for when we purchase land. And so how does that work into the timeline and to the 6-year plan, which I didn't see specifically land assembly as far as beyond the land assembly fund for affordable housing, but if we see a parcel that we want for a park or for something else, how does that fit into this plan? And then the second part of that would be, as we're looking at purchasing land, sometimes those are not purchases that we want to make to keep the land forever, but it's simply to be able to control the destiny of that land a little bit better. So how does the land purchase process fit into the 6-year plan?
Right, actually, part of the department needs database, going with a capital project, land acquisition could be a part of that. So that is actually submitted as part of that capital project.
Okay.
As far as the land acquisition in the budget, we do have environmental lands acquisition budgeted at a certain amount each year, but we don't have the parcels identified in that plan. It's more of a high level at the budget level.
And then also for the economic development, would it just be under that line item? It wouldn't necessarily
Yeah,
be
the
called out?
economic development will be based upon what the Joint Review Committee comes up with. That'll actually be a different process, a separate process.
So the economic development and the land assembly. So they're going to set the
Right.
rules for that, but we also recognize that, every best laid plan's not going to fit perfectly, and so we're going to have to look and be flexible for those opportunity costs when they're available to be able to act. What we have to look at is where it fits into the overall portfolio. If it's number, 2020 on our priority list, well, then just because it's open doesn't mean we act. But it gives us a sense of direction in terms of its priority, but it gives us flexibility to look at those opportunities when they come open.
That's just what I want to ensure, that we do have a little bit of that flexibility to be able to adjust on the fly, not on the fly, but on the fly a little bit when an opportunity presents itself that we don't want to miss out on.
Okay,
Right.
you bet.
Commissioner Welch?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to approach this from a glass half full perspective. We've got a great asset in the Penny for Pinellas. I met with the Mayor's Council yesterday, and we were talking about the partnership that created that 83% approval for the Penny. And I got to tell you, when I saw this chart, the graph that you have on the previous slide, if we can go back to that, and then the budget forecast, which I'm used to seeing from OMB and being in balance, and saw all the red, it's out of balance. I think we have to be very clear in the messaging to the community that, you voted for the Penny, those funds are there, and this is a matter of the Stewart principle where we just got a lot of requests that exceed the capacity of the Penny. We got into a situation with previous pennies due to the recession and other issues where we had to cut 25%. But going into this Penny, I just want to be clear with the community. We've got this great asset. We're going to fund a lot of projects out of it. It's $2 billion in taxpayer money over a decade. But if you just look at this chart, folks see all the red and see that we're in a deficit already for the forecast. So the messaging, I think, is really important. I actually have a fax from Bob Lee. Anybody know who Bob Lee is? Commissioner Justice?
From Naples?
Bob Lee, Robert Lee was a Gulfport city manager. And he sent me this fax back in 2001 when we pulled 22nd Avenue South out of that Penny. And folks depend on the promises we make in terms of what the Penny will do. And I just want to make sure that as we go through this process that it's transparent. And the other question I had on this graph is, does it have fund balance included in this?
Yes, we'll start out with fiscal year 20 with a positive fund balance, and we're using that as we go, so.
So explain just FY20, the expenditures there and the revenues.
Because the revenues are less, because we're using fund balance, and we're able to balance fiscal year 20 because of that fund balance rolling forward.
And what's the remaining fund balance at the end of FY20? You usually have another line that shows that.
Yeah.
So we'll start out 21 at, it's pretty low based on our projections, but about $8 million to start out 21, if we do everything we are planning to do in 20.
And at what point do we make the decision about capital expenditures in 21?
We'll be doing that again this time next year. So when we're building the FY20 budget, starting in January of next year, we'll be looking at the estimates for 20, which, normally our estimates are lower than what's been budgeted, actually considerably lower. So my personal perception of that is that we'll actually start out FY21 much higher.
And all the partners in the cities who are depending on a portion of this, what's the process for them discussing this with us?
This is just the county's penny distribution, so each
Okay.
municipality gets their own penny distribution. So if that's what you're talking about, this is
But
not.
any joint projects on the City of St. Pete Police Station, for example?
Actually, that'll be paid this year.
Okay,
Will be, that's part of Penny 3. That'll be complete.
okay. So
Jackie.
we'll get a revised graph that
Next, yeah, we'll just keep updating this as we
but
go.
it won't stay in this deficit posture, will it?
Again, each year, so for 21, we'll have to balance 21. So I think we'll be able to do that based on what we actually get finished this year, what we actually are doing next year, and that fund balance will roll forward. But right now, where we're at, what we're saying we want to do in each of those years, is pretty optimistic.
And I guess my question is, why don't we take like a zero-based budget approach So this graph looks like they normally look, where we're budgeting to what we can afford, and then if we have additional opportunities later on, we can add those projects. It's just, I'm not used to seeing that,
Right.
that deficit forecast extended.
And I think for this first year, since it's the first year of the penny, it's really an indication of all the requests for penny funding. But you're right, we are gonna have to back into that. We're basically going to say, this is what's available. We really need to reprioritize.
Right.
Madam Chair, Jackie, can you pull your mic down? It's very
sorry.
difficult to hear you
Yes.
when you're talking
Sorry.
that way. Thank you. Well,
Yes.
put them both down so we can hear when you're looking over it, Commissioner Webb. Thank you.
And if
Sorry
I could
about
also
that.
add,
Thank you.
Commissioner
In
Welch,
fact, that's something that I've heard from members of the public, that we all need to pull our microphones down because they're even having difficulty hearing us
Okay,
on the web.
okay.
and Commissioner Welch, if I could also add, what you're accustomed to seeing when you're seeing those balanced forecasts is for operating budgets. And operating budgets look entirely different in terms of their flow than capital
Okay.
do. There are large swings up and down with capital projects. And that's the reason that when Jackie says that when we get to next year and look at FY21, our fund balance is very likely, based on our historical experience, to be much higher than $8 million that we're showing in the forecast today. So between moderating how much we can actually afford and knowing how much we've actually not spent in the prior year, that's how each year we're going to continue to balance.
So that
Now-
graph on slide 13, if we can bring that back up again, that is going to flatten out, or,
Yeah, it has to.
yeah.
It has to. Now, in the out years, can it look a little bit out of kilter? Yes, it can, because that's only a plan. But that just means that we're going to have to adapt as we move forward, and that's part of the conversation that we had a few minutes ago with talking about what are our strategies to be able to balance in future years and moderate what the expectations are around that plan, and focusing on things that don't have specificity where we have the opportunity, and having engaged conversations with stakeholders where we have to actually make cuts to what we had otherwise planned to do together.
Can I ask one other question, Madam Chair? And I'm sorry, I'm just having an accountant moment here. So again, if you look at the FY21 gap on that chart, is it correct to look at that gap between expenditures and revenues as projects that we will not be able to fund, and we need to communicate that to folks? Or are you saying it's just an issue of timing, and that gap is not something to be as concerned about as you would on the general fund? Or
Right now, based on what you see, we cannot do everything that's in the plan. We cannot afford it as it's currently mapped out, going from FY20 all the way through 25 and even through 29. Strategies that we're going to employ and talk about with staff moving forward before we get to 21, so that we can correct that condition starting in 21, are going to be looking at those recurring projects and looking at what the other projects look like. That, with again, the nature of capital projects is that they're very large estimates until we actually get the engineering estimates in and have more specificity to what's it really going to cost. So if you take a particular project on a road, for example, it may say that it's going to be a $20 million project. That is a very high order of magnitude estimate that they may be making before they get to the engineering part of it. Once they do the PER for that, then they actually get more specificity, and it may go up, but it may go down also. And that's when we have a much better idea, and those will be, as those years come forward and we're getting ready to do that project, then we can actually have more confidence in those numbers. That's the reason that when we look at those, we don't get too worried about the fact that it looks out of balance, because we know that there are a lot of things that are going to change.
Okay.
But the important part is that we're making commitments to the community and our stakeholders, and that when we do that, that we have engaged conversations if things are going to change that result in not doing things the way that we thought they were going to.
So,
provided some comfort, thank you.
You're welcome.
well, it doesn't comfort me at all, Madam Chair. I don't know who's,
Pertinent to what
Yeah.
Commissioner Welch just,
yeah, whenever I'm in the queue, I just lost track of who's in the queue.
if it's pertinent to the same issue that he just brought up, it's
Yes, it
fine.
is.
Okay.
Bill, I'm not sure I really understood what you said, because what you said to him makes me really nervous. Are you saying that we have committed to projects with our partners in the community and we don't know, or we think we can't afford them?
No,
Is that what you said?
what I'm saying is that what we have mapped out in the plan that you're seeing today, and specifically when I talk about the plan, I'm talking about 21 through 25.
Correct.
That what we have mapped out in there is something that we've already engaged with our partners and said, this is what we're hoping to be able to do with you together. However, we cannot holistically afford that entire plan. So as we continue to get closer to the dates associated with that, we're going to work together to determine how much funding can we afford to dedicate to that particular project. So let's take a community center, for example, that may be in a particular area that we're talking to the community and making a commitment and engagement. And let's say that community center currently in the plan says $10 million. If we collectively work with that partner and determine, in looking at how much we can afford for the entire program and what they want to be able to accomplish and what it's going to take to do it, we may talk and decide, A, we're going to push that out a year because of cash flow. We may also decide that instead of 10 million, it's going to be 9 million. And that just means that the scope of what that community center includes may look a little bit different. So those are the types of conversations we're going to be having moving forward. The other aspect, as we talked about, is the recurring projects that don't have that specificity. So, for example, if we have $10 million dedicated to facilities projects across the county for governmental facilities, we may determine, you know what, we just can't afford $10 million a year. We can only do, let's say, $8 million a year. And then we're going to program that only for a couple of years so that we can apply specificity, talk to our stakeholders that are impacted by those facilities, and make sure that we're all on the same page about what we are going to do and what we are not going to do, and when we're going to do it.
And so then at what point will we start having those conversations? Because there's nothing worse than setting expectations that are not realistic, and then you end up making an awful lot of people really angry.
We have already started those conversations, and that's why as we continue those conversations, we're going to set the expectations mutually
Good.
about what that means.
Good. Get it in writing if you can.
Commissioner Akers?
Yeah, well, certainly some of these conversations is where my questions were going, because I think about promises made to our residents when we were applying for this penny approval. So there were some big category percentages. I don't remember what they were. You know, it was like infrastructure was going to be 32%, and you know, whatever the percentage breakouts. And those were global, and they were big categories. But and I asked a question a little bit ago about how we plan with our partners, and so this conversation I think is extremely important, because as we were having it, I was looking at one of the partners, my partners in the audience here, from a fire department, and I think this would cause them concern too, because we're trying to let them plan out their process. And if we now, some of this planning, and I just want to, I don't want to get going on that path too far, but those are some concerns I have. But I'm assuming that some of this planning, a penny planning, also shows some years where we're significantly higher, and maybe in some outer years we're going to be lower than the expectation because we front end a little bit on some projects too. So some of that I hope is in these numbers. I mean, I remember one of the partners out there says, I hope you spend every year the same exact amount. I think it was our FAST partners that don't front load it or back load it. But I'm hoping that some of this is reflected that we've been kind of starved on some penny shortfall this current penny, that we probably are front loading a little bit, and we're going to have to figure out how to fund it early from later funds. I don't know how you're going to balance all of that too, but to me this is a little bit of what Commissioner Welch was concerned about, Commissioner Long was concerned about, but I hope some of it's that little balancing of total funds over the period that we anticipate having.
And you're right, document 4 in your package is going to show the 10-year forecast for the penny, based on what we have as requests at this time. And again, knowing that we don't have enough to do everything that is documented there, that does show that we are absolutely front-loaded. And that's by design, that's by intent, and we may, from a cash flow perspective, we may need to push that out a little bit, but we are able to borrow if we choose to. And that's something that we talk to the community about also, is that we do want to front load, we do want to bring those assets to the community as quickly as possible. And if that means that from a cash flow perspective, we need to do a borrowing to be able to enable that, then that's an opportunity that we have to be able to discuss.
So there's a lot built into those numbers.
Yes.
Some of it's overestimations. My guess, and again, typically, that's not always, but, you know, a project that's gonna end up being $7.5 or $8 million, you're putting in 10 million, or 9 million, or something. You try to be over if you're gonna be anything in your estimating, and I'm hoping that that's reflected here as well.
I would say that the project managers tend to do exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
Not everybody, but I think that there's a expectation that they are likely doing that.
Because I think everybody's really excited about the direction that the voters said they wanted to go, and the partners are saying they want to go. So we want to all be excited, and as you said, we don't want to be having multiple disappointments along the way because we've, you know, but anyway, enough said about that. Thank you. Appreciate your.
Well, the one comment that and the chart that you all ought to look at is the reoccurring projects chart. And
Where's that?
reoccurring, just maintenance and of lots of different things is 487 million, which is 49% of the 10-year penny. That's, to me, a very critical piece of this is just basically to improve and maintain. That's what we're looking at. It also includes environmental lands acquisition of 15 million, which is in that reoccurring money. So the question I have is, you know, we have the 6-year plan, and in looking at that, I don't know what's being proposed for fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, if you have staged that by year, just from the documents that are in our backup.
So in the proposed budget, when we bring that forward, we will have the
That.
year-by-year
Okay.
funding that's
This is
associated with
just an
that. So you can see
overall at
very
this point.
specifically which projects are in FY '20.
And then my comment would be, we really need to make sure that we put emergency and necessary projects first. And that is what we need to do in programming the penny, in my opinion. There are other nice-to-do projects that are kind of on a wish list, but we need to do what we need to do first. So,
50% of it, as you said, is kind of like spoken for almost already. So it's not like we have, you know, the whole 90 million every year. It's like in a sense, if we commit to that, half of it's spoken for, and some of that is, well, you can see what it is. It's infrastructure related mostly, I guess. So, but there are obviously public safety items and emergency related items that aren't in here that probably get put right on top of those first. But you're right. It's
And also $11 million of maintenance repairs to this building are listed in that project
I
list
know.
too.
There's something
yeah.
about that.
okay, anyone else at this point? I have to commend you. It's a very comprehensive documents that you have put together. And so
It's been quite a
I'm very
team effort.
appreciative of the level of detail and time that it took to put this all together. I don't think we've had this presented exactly like this before, especially the reoccurring projects. And I think that is excellent information for us to have.
Okay, thank you for the feedback.
Anyone else have questions for Jack? I have one specific question because I'm just kind of curious. Maybe don't need to have the answer now, but there's $500,000 for relocating the Turner bungalow. We already relocated it.
That's probably a description that needs to be revised.
Okay.
That's probably, yeah, that's from Penny 3.
I
There is
thought
a
we already
project.
paid for
Yeah,
moving
that's-
it to Heritage Village and it's in its place.
Mm-hmm.
I know that they're trying to raise monies, I believe, to renovate it, so maybe
It
that's
is.
what that's.
Actually, for fiscal year 20, they have already applied for a grant.
They have.
And it actually won't, that particular project I know won't be 500,000 for 20. Half of it will be grant. There's, I think, actually 250 in 20 and 250 in 22, so they're kind of staggering those renovations.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Just last thing, you know, your comment, I think, was really a good one in that, trying to better understand how you kind of envision that penny each year, because we have those ongoing commitment to capital and maintenance. We have the residents' voice in the back of our minds as to how they wanted us to look at it. So this is going to be a really important project or process every year, so that we can really, I mean, again, I just, it's all about expectations and letting our partners know, you know, it doesn't, you know, and the expectation is also about the dollar, but when it's going to happen. I mean, there are some folks out there that are thinking, I want to be in that second or third year. Well, we're already seeing that it's front-loaded. So if the front-loading doesn't include that right now we can move things around, but we're already leaning in a direction. I think the better we get an understanding of that pass it along to our partners, I think is going to be so critical. So that we're all kind of keep this good attitude of what we have, as Commissioner Welch was saying, the glass half full. You know, it's good stuff that we've got to wrestle with, but it's still going to be really important that we. It's a complicated process. So anyway, I'm sorry. It's probably repeating something already.
Yeah, it's quite a balancing
yeah,
act, really.
it really is.
Commissioner Gerard?
Just wanted to thank you for all your work on this. This is way more information than I've ever had, and I appreciate the breakdown of all the penny projects that were requested and what we intend to do. That's pretty amazing, and I think if we share some of this even with the public and let them know that we're trying to figure out what goes where, I think they could understand looking at this. I mean, you've got a huge job ahead of you trying to fit all this stuff into 6 years. Do we have that many staff?
They've really been working hard on this.
Oh, I know, it's like,
Amazing.
wow. I had no idea that we're this many individual projects that we're working on that are already decided that we need to do, and then some broad categories that are, you know, moving forward. So this
we
is
tried to
great,
make
great
sure
information. Thank you.
That when you referred to that broad category list, what we did in May of 2017, I can say that everything that's on that list, if it was a specific project, it's in this plan. So we wanted to make sure that if we represented it then, we represent it now, whether it's in the 6-year or the 10-year. And, you know, really the 6-year plan is what we're looking at right now. Those years beyond that
Yeah.
are, you know, an idea.
So as we get closer to actually approving a budget, you'll have some sort of plan of how that 6 years plays out? Or you
Yeah.
just, I mean, I know we're only approving 1 year, but
Right, but when we submit the proposed budget in July, you'll actually have that 6-year plan by year. So you'll see what's in 20, 21, 22.
we'll try to be patient.
25.
What is this we business?
I'll be patient. I don't know about you guys.
But, you know, I think it is. It's like we have this 1-year plan that's going to be rock solid, so to speak, and then we have a 6-year plan that gets a little bit fuzzy as you go out there. But it seems to me that there's something in between, like in that 2- and 3-year period, that we're pretty sure where we're heading, and it would be nice to be able to lay that out at some point in a pretty sure category, as you could, because it is, you know, I don't want folks to be thinking that next year they're on something and we just, well, it's just changed, because it can just change 8 years out. That's way out there. 6 years out's another one, but 2 years out is like, it almost should be counting on that.
Right.
As
I would
you're, I
agree
mean,
with you.
as you're doing that, you're having planning probably in 1 year and
Right,
construction in the next or the one after that. So you are gonna have some idea what's in the planning stage and what's,
Exactly, and that's what I was
Going
gonna
out to
say.
bid.
Generally speaking, we look at it as over the first 1, 2, 3 years, we should be pretty sure that that's what's happening in those first couple of years.
That's
Once
great.
you get beyond that, even year 4 and 5, it can start getting a little more a gray area. But when you're looking out past 5, 6 years, it's really
Yeah.
hard to guesstimate that.
That's a good point, Commissioner, about you're starting to get into planning and engineering design work, and
Right.
so we're kind of committing down that path, even though we're not committing to the actual construction other than the 5-year plan.
Right.
So,
Okay, Mr. Engineer.
Okay.
all right.
You may want to stay up here
Okay.
or stay nearby. We have Julie Peluso, who is a fire commissioner in Palm Harbor, who'd like to speak on the capital improvement program.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning.
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 Good morning. Thank you for allowing me
Make
a
sure you
little bit
speak
of
into the
time.
microphone so we can hear you.
We have, we are in Palm Harbor. We are an unincorporated area. We're a partner, per se. We are not a city, and I realize that the cities get specific funding. We have to draw from that pool of the county. And I just want you to be aware that we have a fire station that is in dire need of replacement. It cannot be pushed back. It cannot be pushed back into any other year but right up front. And it's, it floods right now during any rain. It's flooding. The ceiling tiles, I wish I had brought one. They just are stained. We replace them and they get stained again. This, like the Madam Chairman said, that we have to put priorities to emergency, and this is one. And I'm just asking for your help in that, in making sure, spotlighting this specific request. We're capped at 2 mills in Palm Harbor. So we, even though if we were a city, we would be the 4th largest in Pinellas. So we need these funds. We depend on these funds to get this replacement done. And I just strongly feel like we need to have it done right up front. We can't be pushed back. We have only received penny funds one time, and that was, like Commissioner Welch was saying, a lot of them were cut 25%. We were more than 50% cut and pushed back all the way to the end of that penny cycle. And it just wasn't right. It was just, we can't allow that to happen this penny. We have to, because of the station. It's in a flood zone, so we have to evacuate that flood zone. It's got all kinds of issues. It's a metal building, an old metal building, so it needs to be replaced right up front. So I appreciate your priority to this specific request. Thank you. Do you have any questions for me?
Which station are you?
It's 68.
68.
I'm just looking at their website.
It's a required station geographically.
Actually, if you look at your proposed 6-year plan in your backup, on page 10 of 12, it is in as a requested project, Palm Harbor Fire Station 68, to start planning in 20,
Which year?
fiscal year 20, and to do construction in 21. So,
We were not aware of that, so
Yeah,
thank you.
it's
This
actually in the
is,
plan.
someone had said that, we have all been consulted. We have not. This is our very first time we're hearing this, so I would appreciate a copy of that as well.
and actually, once it goes in as the proposed budget to the board, then it'll be published.
Thank
and
you
then
so much.
Once it's adopted.
Appreciate
That is
it.
probably an issue. They probably have not released that pending.
Exactly.
First time we've seen it.
Well, they're gonna present it to their bosses first
Right.
before they tell the partners, so there's a communication piece there.
Sure.
Yes, we'd appreciate better communication in that aspect. So
Well,
we're-
and part of that is, there is quite a process. The request is submitted, and then we have to go through this prioritization and funding and balancing. And so to be back and forth and give misinformation, we'd rather present it to the board first and then communicate that. So that's probably why you didn't know it was in here.
Thank you. Thank you for your
Madam Chair, it's listed right after the Lellman Fire Department.
Yes, it is.
Replacement. Graham is out there, I want to make sure he saw that.
I'm sure, may I ask a question on this, please?
Sure.
No, it won't come up.
Jackie, since you were on that page, I had a question on the emergency shelter, a couple lines above that.
Yes.
It mentions 3 Pinellas County schools, and I know you probably had to truncate the cells. Which schools were they?
Oh, I'd have to look that up.
Okay, and another question I had, Madam Chair, 2 pages before that, under other county buildings, there's $100 million for the centralized downtown Clearwater office building. And my question was, because it says centralized Clearwater downtown a couple of times in here.
Oh, we're not moving?
When I know we probably said that at the time, but when are we gonna have that discussion again about possible location of this potential facility?
Where
We
is he on that?
received the draft report from the consultant that then went to the city and us. I just literally got it last week. Haven't even read it yet. But
That's for the building.
that's that next phase. This is a placeholder, is all this is.
When we say downtown Clearwater, there are other options that we've talked about.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is nothing more than a funding placeholder for
Okay.
a much bigger discussion at a later date.
All right, thank you.
Are you lobbying for Lealman?
Have you met him yet?
There's room at the exchange, probably.
Boy, I don't
We
know.
did discuss and have stressed that we want to do, and I know Commissioner Long has said this as well, that we, if at all possible, to do a partnership with the city of Clearwater.
But they've already started, haven't they? No?
No, they
they
just
haven't.
moved
The-
into
the con-
temporary
Yeah.
Yeah.
building
The
in the Bank of
consultant
America.
report back on it, literally, both the city and county, we got a draft report last week. There was additional exchanges with the consultant, but we haven't had any discussion regarding that.
Well, come on, put the pedal to the metal. Hurry up.
I've heard that.
Said that the other day.
Nothing else going on. Yeah, and on that same topic that Commissioner Welch mentioned on the Pinellas County Schools and the special needs shelter, and I'm sure the thought process is going on because we've got great staff, but we had talked a little bit about moving towards a county facility for emergency or the special needs so that we
Right.
could get our schools back online and people back to work quicker. And so as we start to think about investing in those 3 schools, and the idea was that maybe we're looking at a combination for our community centers with special needs shelters at critical times. I just want to make sure, and I'm sure some of that's going on, so, there we go.
Largo, Palm Harbor University, and John Hopkins.
Largo High, the news? Largo High School? Okay,
And John Hopkins.
thank you.
So, yeah, so that was my only comment. I'm sure that's being thought through. I don't want to spend a whole lot of money on a special needs shelter if we're going in the direction to provide that in a different way. So just, I'm sure all that's being thought through, but
That's the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
is that like all we're talking about on this first part? Are we going to continue having discussions? I mean, is that the only presentation part of the penny? Just all of these different things that we're here, we're
That's
done?
the presentation part for the penny at this point, yes.
Okay.
Thank
Do
you
you
for
want
that
more?
whole, for all that information. That's great.
Well, this is just, we've been talking, so, thank you. We've been talking so long about getting this. For some reason, I'm incorrect in this. I assumed it was gonna be back in February or March, and we've had a lot of people asking about this, so there's a lot to absorb here. And I know you said we're gonna be coming back in July in a workshop fashion, or in,
Address that.
just trying to make sure I get where we're gonna have an opportunity. Because I feel like, is this the input that you guys are looking for your, specifically for next year now, or what, that kind of thing?
So the proposed budget will be presented to you on July 23rd. That's at a board meeting. There is an opportunity for you to provide feedback today, obviously, and there's obviously opportunity for you to be able to provide feedback directly to Barry
Right.
at any point up until that time, and then we'll have opportunities formally and more informal opportunities after the publication of the proposed budget. What we would want to focus on more than anything else is FY20 and what's in FY20, because that's what we're adopting as this is what we're absolutely committing to. Anything beyond that, because of the fact that we are not balanced and we are going to have to make some adjustments, not to say that we don't want feedback on that, but that's not what our critical need is. Our critical need is FY20.
And where can which of these many documents is best shows that 20 plan?
We will get you a document that shows the year by year, so you can see what of those projects is in document 1 is specifically going to hit in FY20. Because document one just shows what's between FY '20 and '25, but doesn't say what's in FY '20 versus what might not start until FY '22, for example.
Projects that get implemented in 20 that have had design work done before, or did they borrow from this penny, or do we get that design cost from the current penny?
We don't look at it as being borrowing from one penny or another. We just have cash that flows in. So we have advanced forward some projects that otherwise would not have been funded. If you remember last
Right.
year and the year before, we did that with a couple of projects. So we look at what's going to balance the fund overall. So if we have fund balance available, that helps support us being able to do, as it showed on the chart, more projects in FY '20 than we have cash coming in, specifically in FY '20.
Yeah, it's just a queuing process, kind of,
Yep.
really. Yeah, thank you.
But Commissioner, the other issue is, obviously, we're rolling this out today. This is a lot of information. We weren't able to get this to you in advance, so having additional conversations between now and July, we welcome that, to where we can get that type of feedback and then come to a cumulative decision there in July.
So, Madam Chair, I have a question. Again, I'm just trying to be clear, because it is a lot of information, and like Barry said, we haven't had an opportunity to have a one-on-one. But are you saying that we will be balanced for 2020, or we
Yes.
will not be balanced for 2020?
We are required by state statute to be balanced, so we will be balanced.
Yeah.
Got it. So we really have big decisions to make at some point, right?
We
The
do.
entire budget.
Oh, yeah, thank you for reminding me about that.
I thought summertime was supposed to be quiet.
Barry and I actually talked yesterday that right after this budget is done, that he's going to be really pushing into next year earlier than normal. And so
Yeah.
that'll be,
Well, keep in mind when you say that the legislature goes in session earlier than normal as well. So we have to really put our pencil to paper to figure out what our deal is.
Yeah, and again, the big year was trying to get, 10 years into one plan.
right.
So the work, was kind of upfront. Now it's kind of massaging that and putting that in. So I think you'll see better refinement earlier in future years.
So what I would suggest for the commissioners to have at least the fiscal year 20 capital improvement plan sooner than later.
We
so
can,
that-
we can provide you exactly the document that you have today, that document one, with year by year for every one of those projects by next week.
Okay,
We have that available, just want to make sure it's formatted in a way that's easy for you to be able to read, consistent with what you've seen, and that it's not in tiny 4-point font.
We appreciate that.
I think that would be very helpful for everyone
That's
to
where
have. And
Commissioner
I,
Welch can take a look.
Oh,
None of us are 50 years old.
my optometrist thanks you. I do have a question since
And I'm only calling out Commissioner Welch because Commissioner Welch has consistently provided that positive feedback about how we need to do better there.
20 seconds.
Great recovery. No, I just wanted to echo your comments. Just a fantastic job on the information and the way it's laid out. One question I had, and I just saw it, maybe it's 7-point, but I did see it. The land assembly on page 3, that 1.7 million, is that for the entire 6 years?
That's actually the leftover from penny 3.
Okay,
The
that's the
allocation from
residual.
penny 3, yeah, because the, really the penny 4 piece is the countywide investment.
And that would that be in a different line item in this 6-year plan, or is it?
The housing piece of that will probably be under that kind of function.
Okay. All right, that answers the question. Thank you. Great job on this.
Yes, Commissioner Eggers.
Yeah, and I think Commissioner Justice brought it up. I was going to make a comment about the land purchase process, that the environmental lands or whatever else. I just had a meeting yesterday, and I walked out, and the person in charge of the facilities at the school system said, "Oh, by the way, we have a piece of property up in Palm Harbor that we're going to sell." And I said, "Oh, well, like when?" He said, "Well, we're thinking about selling it next week." And I said, "Next week?" So I am assuming again that we are plugged in at the right levels to have a lot better lead time on properties that are coming up. I have no idea whether that 18 acres has any value from a stormwater standpoint or any other standpoint. And again, what alarmed me is that he was saying that to me, and I said, I just pray that somebody at some level was well aware of it a year ago, or 6 months ago, or something like that. It's really, these are pieces that we may have no interest in,
That-
but
But the beauty now is that we have a portfolio approach to all of our needs. And so as we look at those opportunities, and we probably won't necessarily publicize that, people.
Understand.
They think their land's worth a lot more when they know we want it. But that we can then look and see whether it's an opportunity we should move up or whether it's way down on the list. So it gives us a sense to be able to kind of, move and make some of those decisions as we go along.
And so maybe just so that we're aware of that partnership process that we have in place,
Yeah.
that might be helpful so that I have, just for one, that I have more confidence that we are actually aware of all these things and that we're kind of processing it at a staff level that says, hey, this one's really a big deal. We need it. It's perfect for what we were thinking about, whatever it is.
And as we come up with that, I think that's where we can do some one-on-ones and really talk about, some of that. And you can remind us of those things, and I can give you a staff report in terms of where we're at, and we can look at that.
To remind you
Yeah.
means I have to remember
Yeah.
that. So that I had a conversation 3 weeks ago from somebody after a meeting on the fly. So it's like, things like that come up.
And so we'll try to do that. I think it is. I think the next step, we've kind of rolled this out, is to make sure and reaffirm those partnerships. I know Lourdes and them met with fire chiefs talking about 68 and others. We need to reaffirm that. So now we've kind of rolled it out. Now we need to make sure that everybody kind of, we reconnect with them and reaffirm where we're at and how we're going. And so, we can do that.
Just one final comment on that, and that, as these properties have been identified, and we had that meeting some time ago to talk about some of those lands that are out there, I would hope at the very least that we have at this, starting to build a database of who the contact point is for that piece of property, phone numbers, and any track record of communication, so that that we've established some kind of connection.
Okay.
Because otherwise we're just kind of got a list over here and we're not working it. And we may have some really good deals out there that we should be taking advantage of, but we wouldn't know that if we're not having any kind of connection with that available property, just as an inquiry, just a general. And I know you have to be careful about expressing interest too strongly, but we're trying to learn a little bit about what's available. So it's difficult. It's a difficult process again, but there's properties right now. I just got a call yesterday from somebody. Well, how's that coming? How's the look for that one property coming? And I said, I don't know what to tell the person. It's like, well, it's in the middle of a process that's being looked at, and there we go. So, it's difficult.
It is.
And so we'll lose things along the way, and as long as it's something that we consciously are aware of and we decide that's cool.
Now that we have the priorities, we can really start working those.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
That's it for Penny.
We'll move on to agenda item 2, which is review the proposed changes to governmental and enterprise user fees and utility rates. Welcome to Lisa Burley.
Morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Lisa Burley, and I'm with the Office of Management and Budget, and I'll be presenting the proposed changes to the user fees for both general government and the enterprise funds. The board policy guidelines is to align the beneficiary of the service to that particular funding level, or for the funding level for that particular service. And things that are considered during that time is cost recovery of that particular service, and then being in line with market rate and peers for that service as well. And then we also look at the administration costs to that. If you move to the next slide.
You have it.
Can I do that here?
You can.
Oh. Okay. We'll look at the general fund revenue by category for fiscal year 18, which was our last actual full revenue. And as you see, 2.7% of the general fund is what makes up the user fees. The majority of the funds coming in is by property taxes at about 70%. And that funds all of the animal services, emergency management, planning, economic development, public safety, most of your general government operations. And for that year, for fiscal year 18, 587.6 million was collected in revenue. Within our financial statements, you might find some fees in other areas such as services, charges for services, and one I will point out in particular is that the sheriff's contracts with the cities makes up about 17.6 million of that brought in on contractual services. That is not under user fees, it is under charges for services, but you will find it within the financial statements. Moving on, looking at fiscal year 20 estimated user fees, and that's that small little 2.7% of the pie on the previous slide. It's estimated at 14.3 million, and 44.7% of that of the user fees is from parks and conservation resources, with 2.1 coming from camping fees for Fort DeSoto, and 1.3 from Fort DeSoto entry fees, which totals about 3.4 million. That represents about 54% of PCR revenues, or parks conservation resources. Also included in that is 1 million in parking, which is Sand Key and Preserve, along with beach parking annual access. Boat ramp parking of about 524.4 thousand, shelters and events and special events 400.9 thousand. Development review service is about 12.9%, which 49.2 comes from services for development review functions. Public Works is a small piece, 4%, and over 99% of that user fee is generated by water navigation.
So I have a question. When you look at slide 3, which is, you said the user fees are 2.7%, and that's what slide 4 represents. So
Correct.
just in perspective, I think you said that you call it entry fees or parking fees. Again, accessing our parks. There's 3 parks that we have that have parking fees associated with them. I'm assuming, is this the place that reflects that?
Yes, it is. And I particularly pointed out Fort DeSoto because has the biggest revenue impact. It's 3.4 million for the entry and the camping fees. The parking fees I put separate, and that was for, I believe, Sand Key, the preserves, and then there's an annual parking pass. I kind of lumped that together. It was a smaller piece of the pie, but the parking alone did represent 16% of that portion. If you don't include Fort DeSoto, because they really don't call it a parking fee. I was told it's an entrance fee, but you have to enter by vehicle, because I did ask that specific question.
Right. So the other 2 parks, there's not an entry fee, but you actually pay a meter. So it's a parking fee, I'm assuming. Again, it's one of those fees that I think the commission at the time that the economy was in the tank, some 9 years ago, implemented that parking or access fee for those 3 parks, because we needed something to pay for the improvements or the maintenance of some of our park system. And so, again, moving it forward, I'm bring it up just for, we don't need to get into it today too much, but just looking at those fees again, because the argument is, well, they're a user fee. Well, we have a lot of parks that a lot of people don't take advantage of, and we don't charge user fees for those parks. These 3 parks were chosen for the reasons they were chosen. I'm not going to second guess any of it. But I think it's just the time. When you talk about 2.7% of our budget, and we're talking parks and conservation's 44% of the 2.7%, and then the parking's probably even a smaller. I just think it's something that we just need to revisit. Again, parking fees, access fees for our residents on things that they already pay taxes on. So just a comment. Thank you.
And there is someone here from Parks if they want to speak on behalf of that.
Okay.
Right. And I just wanted to say I agree with that. I think it is time that, I mean, we did that in the bottom of the recession. I think it's time we let go of those parking fees. Commissioner Welch.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would agree with taking another look at that as well. Had that thought on a couple of recent trips out there. And I did support it at the time, and I think it was necessary at the time. Question I had was, make sure I'm looking at the right numbers. On slide 3, you were showing user fees of 15.8 million. And then on slide 4, you're showing FY20 fees at 14.3. So is that apples to apples?
On page 3 or slide 3, that's fiscal year 18, which
Right.
was the actual received. When we're looking at fiscal year 20, we use a proposed 95% of what we estimate will
So
come
that's
in.
95%, okay.
Yes.
My question was why the decrease, but that
It's-
part of the decrease is at 95%.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just one other question, sorry.
Commissioner
Thank you. There is, on page 2, you talked about the consideration for those fees and competitive with our peers, cover cost of service provided. And I don't know where it falls under these fees, but back to page 4, we start looking at things like, development fees, or I'm changing a front door and there's a fee associated with it. We got into a situation where I used to work that basically was charging, the fee was almost as much as the asset that was being put in. So, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 door was getting a $400 or $500 development fee, or I should say, permit fee. So it was under the, this is how much time it takes us to review the project or whatever. So back to that, again, back to number 2, so it's cover costs of service provided. That's a consideration. Doesn't mean we're always, our goal is to cover the absolute cost of that person on that day going out to see a house and say, hey, the work was done good, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm assuming all that's rolled into this.
Yes,
And-
and it's,
It's cumulative for those types of permit fees, and some you have a limitation on what you charge and do, and it may not cover the cost of the inspection
Right.
of the person's time. Others, you may get efficiencies because you're doing a subdivision, and you can hit, you got an inspection fee, but it's a fixed inspection fee for certain types of things. Your bigger issue is going to be part of our permit review, and should we even require a permit for certain types of things?
Yeah.
And that will be reviewed as part of our.
Yeah,
permit
again,
review.
I just threw that one example out by the affordability or economic impact. I know that there's thousands of fees, so, obviously we're not here to talk about those, but that spirit of reasonableness, it doesn't show here as a dot as reasonableness. I think something we need to continue looking at, because these affordability things are outrageous and I'm not talking about ours now. I'm just talking about ones I've seen in the past, and you just have to say, hey, wait a minute. It's just out of control. So anyway, just a comment that I hope we continue to look at those for reasonableness too. So,
thank you, Commissioner.
all right.
We'll start by looking at the
Well,
proposed,
I just wanted to say respectfully that the issue about the parking fees, Commissioner Eggers has brought it up every year, I think, since he's been here, so I was waiting for him to bring it up again. And my question is, now that we know that we're kind of on a slippery slope, going forward, if we're gonna take those fees away, and then we're gonna have to come up with another revenue source to pay for our parks and recreation, to keep them in the condition they are currently in, because I remember when I first started here, it was pretty dire in terms of what we had let go. And so I'd like to have the discussion, if we're gonna talk about that, where are we gonna pull these dollars from somewhere else in our budget that's already allocated for something else, Commissioner? Just asking. Find that pot, would you please, so that we can,
Oh, hey,
I vote we go.
my
Commissioner
turn.
Gerard.
I don't think that's a fair kind of thing at all. These parks are our resources. The general fund is there to maintain all of our resources, not just the ones that are extra. And just because we raise that fee during the recession doesn't mean that we have to keep it forever. We're not in a recession right now. We might put that back if we ever go back into a recession, and we might have to make some other changes. But I think we shortchange our fees, I mean, our parks all around. They're still at very, very low staffing levels, and we can talk about that later. But, you know, we have not restored them to the point where we've restored every other department in the county. So to talk about where are we gonna get that money from, that's one of our responsibilities.
well, I understand that. My point is, before we make those decisions, wouldn't you like to know where we are gonna pull that money from? That's our responsibility too.
No, I expect them to support our parks and maintain our parks to a decent level, and I don't think we need to be charging our residents for parking. I think we need to prioritize the parks again, not necessarily at the top of our priority list, but somewhere on the priority list. So, there, that's what I
Wow,
think.
this is rather interesting. I guess I'll weigh in. Our parks are wonderful assets, and so to that end, it would be interesting to look at staffing levels pre-recession versus staffing levels now. And to understand, that being said, I know that they came up with some very innovative ways to be able to maintain our parks during the recession, roving crews and, so for instance was a lot of the crews were painting picnic benches on a very, very regular basis. Instead, that became a more delayed project. But and we've also been fortunate to have a lot of volunteers who have stepped up to the plate to help us in our different parks and preserves. So that being said, we charge fees in several different areas. So if for animal services, should we stop charging fees there? You could open, I think the parking fees have helped to maintain our parks, and they're user fees just like at animal services or somebody coming in to get a permit. They're using our resources, and I think that it helps to, medical examiner, you could look at everything that we do, and we have user fees throughout the entire county for the people who use our services. Commissioner Welch?
Well, and you probably were out of the room when I spoke to it. I think there was a lot of pressure on us. There were hundreds of layoffs. We were really impacted, and that's why we imposed those fees. It's interesting at the Mayor's Council, Mike Twitty gave his presentation, and I want to send y'all a copy of it, but I think he showed us before. This is almost a carbon copy of '06 in terms of property values being right back where they were. We're in a good spot. So I agree we have to be very cautious going forward, because you don't know when the next, God forbid, recession or oil mishap or what have you. But one of the things that has concerned me, and we've never been able to get it right, and it's not our fault, is the queuing at that location where you have to pay the $5. And we never able to get an agreement with FDOT to, put it on SunPass or put it at the original station. So you've got this queuing, and the last time I was out there for an event, that line was very long at the gate where you pay the $5. So I'm concerned about that as an inconvenience. But also, you know, I think he said there's a 7.5% increase in property values this year. We were back to the point where I think we can afford to take a look at it. Not saying it will never come back, but for those 3 parks, you know, that $5 is something we had to do then. I'm not sure we have to do it now. So I'd like to at least talk about it, see how much we're bringing in from those fees. I don't know if Paul's here or if you know how much we bring in from those parking fees. But I think it's time to at least have the discussion, not saying that we never would have to impose those, but we're back in a good place, and I can understand the, you have an answer?
Standing in for Paul today.
Okay.
Lyle Fowler, Pinellas County Parks and Conservation Resources Department. Sandkey, we'll start there, has had a parking fee for a bunch of years, at least 15 that I've been with Pinellas County. In 12, we took it over, so we self-operated, and Clearwater had been managing it for us previously. Fort DeSoto and Howard Park were newly instituted, and they were instituted with the idea of staving off additional cuts. So the thought was we preserve some of the operating budget with the idea that we would impose the user fee. So rather than look at increasing the millage, it was a user-based system. If you visited Fort DeSoto or Howard Park, you paid.
So you know the revenues we brought in from Fort DeSoto and Howard?
I don't know off the top of my
Ballpark.
head. We may have them here.
Okay. But I think I would support at least having the discussion now.
We can look at this and bring it up if they have additional detail, but we certainly can look
I
at it.
think
and
they
bring it
have the
back to you.
numbers.
Yeah. 1.3 million in the Fort DeSoto parking fee. Do we know where the other two are? Beach access parking. So also worth mentioning is Madeira Beach, for example,
Right.
has always had a parking fee. We also self-operate that around the same time, 2012. Beach access parking is bringing in 1.2 million. And so the other beach accesses, we have agreements with the municipalities for a revenue share. So St. Pete Beach, for example, they manage the meters and they do the parking enforcement, and we split the revenues 50-50.
Okay.
So
Was Howard separate?
Howard is standalone. We manage it separately.
You have a number
PCR.
for that one?
I think Howard is in with the beach access, 1.2 million.
It is. How about Sandkey's been metered for as long as I ever remember.
Yes.
So that's a case in point that we've had paid parking there for as long as it's been open, I believe.
So, Madam Chair, I have a question. I wasn't here when we put that fee in place, but my understanding is the only parks where we have fees, please correct me if I'm wrong, are the ones that have saltwater frontage on the Gulf, correct? And I do believe that that requires an extra level of due diligence in order to maintain the park because of the salt water, especially the ones that have marinas.
I'd
Billy.
also like to, just to provide additional context to that decision point back then, and obviously we can change that decision at any time, that's your prerogative, but the other justification in putting those in place is that these assets that we own and are responsible for were the only assets that were on the Gulf that did not have a parking fee or entrance fee associated with them. And visitors pay that as well. So while we talk about the residents a lot, a large portion of the revenue, especially when you're talking about Howard Park in particular, Fort DeSoto Park in particular, is coming from our visitors. So much like when we talked about the penny and the fact that a third of our revenue came from visitors, we don't have a figure on exactly what the percentage is, breakdown that I'm aware of visitors versus residents and how much of the revenue comes from each. But I feel pretty confident saying that there's a pretty good percentage that is coming from visitors visiting Fort DeSoto and also those other beach parks. So that's the other piece of that puzzle that I want to make sure is context.
And we could not exempt locals.
We cannot,
as
due to
well.
the funding that we had to help support either acquiring and/or grants since then to maintain those parks and improve those parks, we don't have an opportunity to be able to charge different fees for residents versus non-residents, unincorporated versus incorporated. there's no opportunity to do that. And that was something that we did explore pretty significantly way back when we were looking at that.
So to Commissioner Welch's observation at Fort DeSoto, I think it's time to go back to FDOT and see if there's an opportunity to shorten the queue and have SunPass or have something that is more efficient, because I would be frustrated if I was waiting there too.
You have to pay the fee.
So maybe that helps to, and then we also, don't forget, we have boat ramp parking to maintain our boat ramp, so that's a user fee too. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it, but I think that they are, as Bill pointed out, necessary for preserving our wonderful parks.
Well, I think it's something we ought to talk about in context of a complete conversation, not necessarily make any decisions this morning, because again, I think each of our parks, just basic access is one thing. Spending the night, loading a boat onto the water, there are additional things in addition to just accessing the park. So, again, somebody brought up the fact that we have a lot of tourists using it, and we've talked about how our funds that we get on the bed tax and how to use those for transit possibly, or how to use that for operating expense reimbursement to our parks. I brought that up a couple of times now. So as long as we can make the nexus. So there's ways that we can get funding that are directed at tourists that can help us offset some expenses at our parks. That's something we ought to look at too. So just from the standpoint of where do we find the money, and it's certainly not to the extent of transit by any sense, but there are some reimbursements that are legitimate, so that can help defray some of those costs. But I think we have that conversation in total. I think it's fair. But to lump them with all the other fees, and then we have to look at all the fees, that's a whole different conversation. That's not what we're going. That's not the rabbit hole that I'm going down. I just think parks are a different thing, and to have charges for getting into a park that you already pay your millage for is just intrinsically counterintuitive to me, other than what you guys did because of the economy. That's a different animal. We didn't have that same philosophy until the economy triggered that thought process. I'm not talking about Sand Key, but I'm talking about some of these other parks. So anyway, enough of that.
Well, why should Sand Key be different then?
Well, maybe we should look at Sand Key too.
So,
I mean, we just have a philosophical difference, Madam Chair, about park access. That's all. I don't think we should be charging our residents to access our park. I'm not talking about the special needs like camping or something like that. I'm just talking about accessing our parks. They pay for it already. So if we can afford to do it, and I think that's the point some people have made, let's look at it. That's all.
Okay, thank you. We'll start looking at the fees within the general fund. There are, and if you reference your summary of charges that should be attached, you'll see the individual fees listed under animal services. There are several on there, and they have experienced the last couple of years increased costs in both technical, veterinarian, labor, and medical procedure and medical supply costs as well. And a lot of those charges are based on that increase, and they're listed individually. The second one would be a new fee in real estate management, and that would be for the rental of the gallery at the Pinewood Cultural Park. And there are two fees there. One is based on the actual time of the event. If it's daytime, there's one fee. If it's evening or weekend, there's a different fee, obvious because of overtime and rent, or the cost of park ranger utilization and janitorial services. The airport, the changes in existing fees is due to the ground transportation reorganization. Again, if you look at your summary of charges, there's quite a few changes on there, and they completely reorganized the ground transportation. And the second one was they added a new one to the terminal service charge to scale it in a different way, approach which awards a greater number of departures rather than just the weight of the airplane. Building services, there is it says 10% increase, but it's an average of 10%. And that was based on, they haven't raised the fees since 2011. They looked at their comparable market rates in other areas for those particular services. So some might have gone down slightly and some gone up, but overall it's an average of about 10% increase. Solid waste charges, the majority, it's 2.5. The majority is 2.3, and that's based on the BCC rate resolution, which was approved on 3/12/2019. There's a new charge for out-of-county solid waste. They're not anticipating any revenue, or very little, if any. And then also there's a $231,000 anticipated increase because of the increase in special handling service fee to compensate for association with special disposal requests, which is estimated at the $231,000.
So that 2.3 million then that's the tipping fee increase? Okay, just. Yeah.
Yes, from the rate resolution 3/12/2019.
So it is, I'm getting a nod. I just want to make sure that the language that you used is the same as the one I use, which is tipping fee increase.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This is a utility rate overview, and this is the consistent with the 4-year plan that was just adopted May 21st, 2019 for fiscal year 20 through fiscal year 23. The water system is expected to generate approximately $747,000 in additional fees. The sewer system, $6.8 million, and the reclaimed water system, approximately $709 million. Thousand, I'm sorry.
Question.
Sure.
On the sewer system, and again, I just want to make sure I remember correctly. It seemed like we were having the larger increase there to cover some pretty hefty capital expenses that are coming up in the next 3 or 4 years. So that at the end of that 3 or 4 years, once that capital is in place, that will be that continues to be relooked. I mean, I'm sure there will be some requirement for increases for capital, but the large increase could be back down. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. I just want to make sure that increase is because of capital. But anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. Megan Ross, Utilities Director, Pinellas County. The increase is largely driven by capital improvements to the sewer system. So, and we will reevaluate that on a periodic basis, likely in about 3 years, like we do every 3 or 4 years. We reevaluate that and determine the needs going forward. So,
could you summarize really where you see that big bulk of the dollars going in that capital increase that you see coming? Is it in pipe replacement? Is it in facility renovation?
Sure. There's about, and this might not be exact, but there's about 60% going to our wastewater treatment facilities. So where the wastewater is conveyed and treated to high-quality reclaimed water and also effluent. So making sure that we have proper treatment processes in place, removing phosphorus, removing nitrogen, getting all of the pollutants out of the water, and making sure we have a really robust treatment system in place that's reliable. And then the other 40% is going to the collection system, pump station rehabilitations, piping, force main replacements, and other corrective measures and improvements.
Okay. And then the other question would be, I know that you all have done, along with Commissioner Justice, a lot of work in the sewer system task force. I don't call it the sewer system task force, but with respect to, I guess, infiltration issues. So some of this replacing lines for the in-line infiltration problems, some of that's going for that, I'm assuming?
Yes, so a lot of the pipelining and pipe replacement projects, as well as pump station improvements, will be going towards preventing some of that water intrusion from getting into the system.
And finally, is there any update, and I missed your meeting, so you probably, is there any work at the state level to help our residents with the lateral issue? You know, the $5,000 to $10,000 capital requirement for lateral improvements for infiltration issues. Is there anything new going on in that regard?
So there was no formal legislation that got adopted, from what I understand, from this year in the state. But as a county, we are going to be embarking upon looking at different ordinance structures to adopt as a county, and possibly with also our partner cities. So we will be looking at that. So there's a number of different structures we're looking at, and that was presented at the Wastewater Stormwater Partnership presentation. But I can go into more detail if you'd like.
Fine.
But
No, that's good. That's good for now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Megan.
The only other in the utility area was the water revenue operating. And this fee was already, the one that's being deleted was already included in the fire line assembly, so they were just deleting that particular item. And those are all the proposed changes. These changes will be rolled up into the user fee and presented in the fiscal year 20 user fee schedule and presented to the board in the proposed budget. Any other questions?
I had one other question. There's the reclaimed master plan, reclaimed water master plan, which is finishing or finished or whatever. There's some recommendations from that, including metering the system in North Carolina. Sorry, Megan, should have asked you while you were up here. So how much of that is in the 2020 budget, that conversion to metering, or is that kind of a 2021 thing? Or just so people are starting to hear about it, probably because I've started talking about it, but I just like to make sure I'm somewhat accurate in where we are in that.
Yes, that is in the budget, and I believe the total's about $6 million over the next 5 years. It's broken out in a certain amount. I think there's $600,000 over the next 3 years, and then it goes up to $2 million. So I don't have the exact breakdown in front of me, but
Mostly in that conversion to metering, to house metering? Or?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so whether or not, and we still, because we're going to be using an outside contractor to help get this program done, hopefully in a more cost-effective manner, but also quicker. We're awaiting some of the pricing that we're going to get back. So we're going to be putting that out as a bid and getting all the pricing back and determining how that fee is going to be established and either paid for by the customer or the utility or how we're going to do that. So we're awaiting those prices to get back. But either way, we're going to have to finance upfront those costs. And if that fee gets put back on the customer and financed over a period of time, we'll still have to front load and finance the cost.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
Megan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions?
Just real quick, and you might know, Madam Chair, is there a part of our budget that shows all the fees on 1 or 2 pages, the fee and the amount of revenue for a particular year? Is that in the budget anywhere?
It typically is in the budget, has been in the past. I assume we'll be doing it again.
I'm thinking like the format of the summary of changes that you have. Do we have that for every fee?
We do not have that for every fee.
Okay.
And we could I can say we can definitively break that down based on the accounts that are used for those fees. But if you take the building services fees, for example, those are all loaded into one account.
Okay,
If you took that whole list of, probably 6 to 8 pages of different fees for building services, there are reports we could generate, but putting that in the budget document is a far greater level of detail than we've seen a positive purpose in.
Yeah. If it's
So-
an exercise, I like the format of what you have here, and I just wondered if you have all our fees so we could get an overall view of it.
We haven't done it that way, but that's something we can look at.
If it's a big exercise, don't bother, but thank you.
I thought, though, that typically, like if we were increasing something at animal services, we were,
We see the changes, but I was trying to
Right.
get countywide view of all the fees we charge by line item.
Oh, I see.
Regardless of
And
whether
what-
there's a change in the fee
Yeah.
itself
Okay,
or
because
not.
wondered
we
if we had
typically
that.
do see that, right?
See
The
the
summary of changes that
Yeah.
you see,
Yeah.
you'll see the revenue impact of the changes in fees, but we haven't published something that specifically says, here are all the fees that you have, and here's the revenue associated with the fee, regardless of whether or not there's a change to that fee or not.
So can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So how many fees do we have altogether? Trivia.
Hundreds,
Hundreds?
hundreds,
Hundreds?
hundreds.
Yeah.
Well, now you got me curious.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the adopted budget document, we have the full user fee schedule in there,
With all the fees?
every single fee. And that
Okay.
itself is 15 to 20 pages in probably a 12-point font. So,
And does it show the revenue generated for
It
each
does not-
fee?
it does
Okay,
not.
that's the part that's.
right, that's the part that isn't in there that you're asking about.
Could you see if that's doable without a whole lot of manipulation?
We can do something that would be more of a roll-up, that wouldn't be by every one of those 15 to 20 pages of fees, but we could do it for building services, for example. These are how much we're generating for that type of fee.
Y'all are busy. Let me just look at what we have already.
Okay,
All right, thank you.
you're welcome.
So much for your 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know it was hundreds.
I don't think any of us
Okay,
did.
so, just curious.
Well,
Thank you,
Lisa, thank
Commissioners.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next we're on agenda item 3, review decision packages and funding strategies for proposed budget.
Bill's up.
Is that Bill?
It's Bill.
All right, Bill.
I'm back. So just to set context again regarding what we're going to be doing today with this particular aspect of our work session, the intent here is to present some ideas for what we might be able to do from a funding perspective for the various decision package requests that are there. But our intent is not to make final decisions today. Our intent is to get feedback from you and then use that feedback to inform what will be published in the proposed budget, knowing that we will have opportunities after the proposed budget is published to continue to make adjustments to that plan. So with that, first of all, we'll talk about the current state and a little bit of background on where we stand today. We'll talk about those strategies that I just mentioned, and then we'll talk about what the next steps are in the budget process. As far as balancing strategies, just a reminder of what we typically will try to do. First of all, we have a reserve policy of 15%. Our intent is to retain that. We also will continue to maintain recurring investments in public safety and human services programs that we've made in past years. We'll talk a little bit about that later. As far as the general fund itself, and we've talked about that a little bit just now with respect to the user fees and where the user fees fit in context. But overall, and to your point, Commissioner Welch, what you'll see is that the general fund forecast does show that it's balanced throughout the forecast period. That's based on a variety of assumptions, the most important in some respects being that the millage rate will be staying at the same millage rate. It also maintains that target reserve level of a minimum of 15%. As far as balancing strategies, some of the other things that we will continue to employ are continuing to pursue efficiencies without compromising services, and also using non-recurring funds for one-time expenditures, because they're not sustainable for recurring expenditures. As far as the general fund forecast, this reflects what we look like today before we would build in any decision packages that we're going to discuss. So as you can see here, the fund is balanced. You can see the green line is just a hair above the red line, which means that on a recurring basis, we're bringing in just a little bit more revenue than we have in expense that we're anticipating. Now, what we'll share with you as far as context and remind you is that this forecast is our estimate of revenue. We're required to budget at 95%. So if we were to build in the 95% version of this, we would not be in balance. So just as context, that's okay, that's not a problem, because we know that we are going to bring in more than 95% based on our historical experience, which is why we present the forecast from an estimate perspective. But budget-wise, when you see the fact that we're above 15%, that doesn't mean necessarily that we have extra money lying around, because we have to balance 95%.
And we're
What is
also,
that?
I'm sorry.
What's that percentage, do you think? 98%?
The
Well,
estimate
yeah,
versus
yeah.
what we,
Yeah, I mean, you're over, But you said that doesn't include it being dropped back to 95. If we
Correct.
were- Where would it be if it was
Each of the re-
truly balanced, about 98, 97?
Each of the revenues is different. So if you look at property tax revenue, which is our largest
Okay.
revenue source,
Gotcha.
that one, for example, our historical experience is in the 96% range as opposed to 100% of
Gotcha.
what the values would bring in. And the reason, as you all know, would be because of the fact that if you pay by November 30th, you get a 4% discount, and most people do that.
The other thing I wanted to just highlight, though, is we're looking at 7.5% for our property tax rate growth this year. They're projecting out 4.5% for budgeting purposes in future years. And so that's where it gets fuzzy, you know, where are we at in the bubble? And
But you're saying that the proposed forecast for 20 is 7%?
7.5.
Oh, 7.5.
Yes, the values that were just published by the property appraiser last week showed 7.5% growth in taxable values for fiscal year 20.
Makes me nervous.
And we're budgeting 4.5?
No, we're
No.
budgeting 7.5.
Oh, we are budgeting.
The out years, starting
For
from
out
FY
years.
'21 through '25, that's the 4.5%.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Thank you.
So this is a summary of all of the decision package requests that we have on the table that we're looking at together, and it's done by agency, and as you can see, we have $40.8 million in total that's being requested, and as far as net general fund impact that we're estimating, it would be about $20.5 million in requests. And as we'll see, we can't afford $20.5 million as much as we'd like to. So back to Barry's point in the beginning, using our heart, but also using our heads. As far as an approach, a couple of strategies that we're putting in place in terms of what you're going to see for what we would propose to get feedback on is our social action programs, continuing the current social action programs that we have, and that's really anything around human services, and then also providing a recurring appropriation for prioritized social program areas, and recipients would be determined through a competitive grant process. So I'll talk about this a little bit more, but conceptually the idea is we already have a social action funding program that funds a variety of human services partners in the community, and there are a continuing series of requests that we get from individual partners for funding for similar types of programs. So the idea would be get feedback from you from a policy perspective about what kind of funding level and what are the specific program areas you want to address, and then use a comparable competitive program to determine who are the ones who are going to provide those services and meet those needs, instead of taking on the individual requests.
Commissioner
I'd just
Gerard?
like to support that approach. That's something we used to do in the past, and I think it's a much more equitable way of doing things instead of just funding the same things over and over. And having some strategy about what we want to be supporting.
The other area is the sheriff. The sheriff obviously has a series of requests that he's made, and we wanted to make sure that we provided funding to support the operational increases that he expressed for the programs that he currently has, provide funding to support the vehicle replacements that he needs to make, and then provide some additional funding to be invested at the sheriff's discretion, because the amount that we can afford to provide to him doesn't meet all the needs that he has, and he's best equipped to be able to determine how are those limited funds best invested in those or other needs. So strategically, that's what we have in mind with what you're going to say. So as far as the proposed funding, what we're proposing is that in the human services area, that there'd be about $1.7 million that we're being able to afford to put forward. Public defender, $146,000, and then the sheriff, $5.6 million. So a total of $7.5 million of impact in the general fund to be able to support decision packages. CVB, there's about $600,000 that's coming from the Tourist Development Tax Fund. And then also Public Works has about $67,000 for a decision package request related to T-BARTA and their funding needs for the next year. So as far as the general fund forecast with the decision packages, this reflects what it would look like if we invest that $7.5 million. And what you'll see is that we're slightly out of balance when we add the $7.5 million. We're okay in FY 20 and 21, but as we get into FY 22 and beyond, we start to see the slope decrease in terms of our reserve percentage. And again, I'll remind you that this is the estimate, not the 95%. If we put the 95% in place, we're going to be upside down. So The other thing I want to show you, which does actually show us going upside down, is that over the past several years, we've invested about $7 million on average into new decision packages that are going to be funded by the general fund every year. If we were to assume in our forecast that we're going to continue with that trend, and every year add another $7 million on top of what we've already done each successive year, this is what your forecast looks like. As you can see, there's a much more significant imbalance that starts to develop. So providing that context is just to provide the insight that if you want to invest all that $7.5 million this year, we can do that, but that's going to constrain what we can afford to do in each successive year. And we can't continue on this trend, at least not based on what we're forecasting.
I'd always hoped that we could have this conversation before we go about our developing our decision packages, because I think this really does put it in context. And maybe, I know it's one thing to kind of up front just kind of throw ideas out there, but the reality piece is so, I mean, this is pretty profound. And you know, the thinking process for our decision packages clearly would be different. And so we always do it up front, and then you come back and tell us the good news about what we can't even begin to think about. So, but anyway, appreciate this is really good. That's a really powerful graph right there, I think. It really does tell a story.
I think that needs to be shared with our partners as well.
No, anything, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
With, I'm sorry.
With the partners.
Apartments?
Yeah,
Oh,
partners,
partners, yeah.
yeah.
Commissioner?
Thank you. So on this slide that you've got now, you're assuming that we would add, this is adding 7 million every year?
Adding a new $7
A new
million
seven.
every year.
All right, so that, I mean, I think that's, we're not gonna, I'm assuming that we're not gonna do that.
And
But we
the
have
reason
been
we use
doing
that scenario, that I'm presenting that scenario, is that is what we have been doing for the past several years.
That's
So this is
correct.
our
That's the
historical,
problem.
recent historical experience.
Fair enough, okay. The part of that 7 million though would not be recurring, would it? I mean, some of the things in the decision package on the slide before we talked about would be capital. So it may be recurring in a few years, but not recurring every year, like the sheriff's vehicles.
The sheriff's vehicles,
Well, that is
even though
recurring
we are
every-
putting in $1.6 million per year for 4 years, next year the same thing's gonna come forward. So there's a vehicle replacement funding strategy that we need to look at with the sheriff cooperatively to address that moving forward, because this has been a consistent request that he's had really since the recession.
Okay.
Because he used to be able to accommodate that within his budget without asking for additional monies. Once he sustained the cuts, just like the rest of the departments did during the Great Recession, he hasn't been able to climb out of that and be able to have the funding to be able to support that without getting additional infusion.
And that's also another area as we look at our legislative plan for one-time capital projects that the sheriff's department certainly could be more vigorous as far as legislative requests. And that we have friends at the right places in the next couple of years. Helicopters, those kind of things, one-time purchases, the state looks at a little bit more friendly than recurring. But my last question was going to be, for example, on the social action fund that we talked about, so we put a fund total for that program, and then at what point would it come back to us, or would it be at a department level for decisions for which organization or vendor, for lack of a better word, we would be using for that targeted service?
That's a conceptual idea that we have right now, and the concept is to model something similar to social action funding that we already have in place, that based on my perspective and what I've heard, seems to work relatively well. I would assume that we're going to take a similar type of approach in terms of thinking about that, but I would say that the experts in that area, Lourdes, Daisy, and her team, would work with the stakeholders to determine what is the best process to make it competitive, make it fair, engage the stakeholders, and give you the opportunity to engage in the way that you need to as well.
Good enough? Thank you.
Commissioner Welch?
Thank you, Madam Chair. While we're on this steward principle slide, that's what slide 10 is, unlimited needs and limited resources. Just following up on Commissioner Justice's points, to my recollection, the sheriff pretty much drives the decision packages every year. It's the bulk of the amount.
Seeing as how he's half of the general fund, it's not surprising that
Right.
there's a more significant portion that comes from the sheriff than does from the rest of the departments
Sure.
collectively.
So the vehicles, did we explore, we had talked about possibly funding that from the penny. Did we look at that option?
We have, and the fiscal reality, as we talked about earlier when we talked about the penny earlier in this work session, is that we can't afford everything that we all want to be able to do with the penny without having the vehicles funded out of the penny. So can we do it? Yes. Did we do it on a one-time basis 2 years ago? Yes, we did. If we do, that just takes more money off the table for all the other priorities that are currently vying for those penny funds.
We have a public safety component of the penny though, correct?
We do.
And I guess in my thinking, that would allow us to fund what the sheriff wants and allow us to focus on some of our other priorities in terms of decision packages. So I still would like to have that out there as an option we can talk about. The other question I have for you, somewhere in your notes, you mentioned that the Housing Trust Fund dollars, you weren't recommending that we fund that out of general fund because there were new options under the land assembly. What are the new options?
So if you recall during the discussion about economic development side of the countywide investments from the penny, the economic development portion of the state statute provides different opportunities in terms of flexibility for how we spend those funds. And specifically as it relates to affordable housing, what it allows for is if we can draw a nexus between the housing and the economic development to be able to demonstrate that there is going to be a positive impact on economic development by undertaking a housing project, there is a very broad opportunity for using those penny funds under that economic development portion of the statute. So the flexibility that we were trying to gain through using the general fund as a funding source for those projects, because it was only land assembly under the affordable housing piece of the state statute, that flexibility now can be taken advantage of without using general fund, but instead using the economic development provision of the statute.
As long as it's under that economic development banner.
Correct.
Okay. And on social action, I agree with the concept. My only question is, one of the problems we ran into last time is the amount of staff time and work on a relatively small amount of dollars. So what are y'all gonna do to streamline the process and while keeping it transparent?
I can't speak to that because we haven't developed that process yet.
Okay, but do you recall those issues where,
I think Daisy would be better able to address kind of what we've experienced before and whether or not there are opportunities to be able to streamline that better this time.
okay.
And it's Lourdes Benedict, not Daisy. It's okay. Assistant County Administrator Daisy's here as well. But it's been about 3 years ago, we're ready to redo that, our social
Okay.
action funding. And it was some work, but I think it was a good process. As you recall, or some of you may recall, we brought in some stakeholders to rank and review all of the applications that we got. So it was a good process. We got a lot of good feedback. I would recommend doing it again.
Okay.
However, with the ones that we have right now, the request, I don't know how quickly we can turn that around for a couple of months from now, or for you all to even approve.
Yeah.
So it's something we're gonna have to look at, but it was a good process.
But even where you had individual programs that were funded through a decision package, you still had to develop contracts and metrics and things
All
for
of
them.
that.
So we
Yes.
still had the staff work
Right.
involved. We just didn't have the competitive selection. So.
Right, exactly.
But prior to the new process, the old process got kind of convoluted, the old social action process.
I think maybe you're talking about years ago.
Yeah, I am.
This is
Yeah.
about 3 years ago. We put in a whole new process.
So the new one, you're
Which was
confident?
streamlined, efficient, brought in stakeholders. It was some work, but it's how I would do it again.
So you mentioned timing, and I know there's one program, and I don't want to just isolate on one program, but there's one that we're funding this year, the Urban League Youth Program, which was a decision package. If it rolls up under this grant process, when will y'all be geared up to make decisions and fund programs? It won't be October 1.
Right, and that's what I was just referring to. If we added a social action funding process that we have to these that we just got in, that would be a quick turnaround for you all to
I think
approve
it's
by July.
too quick for y'all to implement.
That's actually a good point, though, and something that we need to think about.
Okay.
'Cause especially where you have current funded programs and there could be a gap.
Right. Thank
I
you.
have a comment. I would just like to see it be even more open than it was 3 years ago, that going back to, I know it was complicated, but going back to how we used to have it with us setting some guidelines about what we want to be funding rather than sort of random little programs here and there. I think, if we want to have some impact and we want to be
And that's what we
supporting
did.
systems, I think, then.
That's what we did, especially, I know the last go-around, adult service-related issues were important, were a priority to the board. So
Right.
we added extra funding, got extra points for those programs. But, we can come back and see what the priorities are now exactly and
Yeah,
and look at
yeah.
that.
I just,
Thought we had prioritized, really basic services, food, shelter kind of thing.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really emergency needs.
I think
It
it's
might
good
have
for the
been right
community
before
to
you
know that
started.
there's an opportunity for different things to come in and not necessarily
Same old.
everybody's favorite, but,
Yeah.
not necessarily the same old if
That's-
it's not working.
Point well made.
Okay. Just saying.
It having more of a competitive process.
Yeah.
Is what you're going after.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks.
I had a question for Bill.
Yes, Commissioner Eggers.
I was looking back at the, I guess it's slide number 3, where you talk about best practices and continual improvement. Certainly from my perspective, whether it's public safety, human services programs, and to me, and we just talked about it with regard to Penny, infrastructure has got to be in that sentence to me someplace. And maybe you imply it somewhere else in there, but for me, maintain recurring investment in our infrastructure is one of those best practices and should be included. Real quickly, we do an awful lot of work, our staff does, on capital planning. And for the most part, these decision packages, I don't know, I don't know what percentage of them are capital or operating, but can you just maybe step back and tell us this extra process that we're going to for decision packages? What is it for? What are you trying to incorporate some of our thoughts? I mean, I see other decision packages. How is that different than the capital planning that we already do? How is this process that we're going through different? I just want to know where it came into being, and we've been doing it for a long time, but just curious.
Forever
Yeah.
we've been doing
No,
this?
we haven't always done that. We didn't have any input under a form when Bob was here. Remember that?
Yeah, well.
Oh, yeah.
So just was trying to get some maybe perspective on this decision package process.
So
So-
when you talk about infrastructure and investing in infrastructure, that absolutely is a core principle that we have.
Yeah, I know it is.
That's applicable to the capital side of the budget. The general fund is the operating side of the budget. That's the reason it's not mentioned in that slide. And the reason we have a different process for the general fund is because on the capital side, we're using the portfolio management approach that we've recently adopted. That's our process for incorporating and prioritizing. As it relates to the operating fund here and the other operating funds that you're seeing in decision packages, the intent there is to provide an opportunity to request and consider changes in service levels, changes in services that we're delivering to our community. Because the way that we build our budget today, and have been for several years, is based on the assumption that we continue to do the same thing tomorrow that we did today. Same program, same functions, same service levels. So we apply an inflationary factor based on what we experience in costs. We measure what that is, we calibrate to that, and anything that's deviant from that, whether it's new or whether it's a change in level of service, even a reduction or elimination of a service, is considered to be a decision package. So that's the concept that we have
Okay.
around that.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay.
So did you want to walk through the individual recommendation or individual ideas for each of those? We have that documented for you in your package. We could walk through one by one if you'd like, or we could just continue to have an opportunity for you to provide feedback to the administrator between now and when the proposed budget is published.
This would be,
The summary B3 slide.
budget information session. I have the summary V3.
Yes.
What I'm looking at. which is the third thing down on your attachments.
Oh, hold on. Yikes.
Starting with business technology services.
That's not on the screen. You
So
can't
wanna-
read.
no, it's not on the screen. We can
Okay, you
certainly
just
put
walk
that
through
up
it.
on the
What
screen.
is it, Commissioner?
Third one down,
The third one, or on which?
on the attachments.
On 3B, you said?
Yeah.
It's the one that looks like this.
Legislation text, summary V3A, and then I'm
3A.
looking at summary V3B.
Oh,
Is that the one we want to look at, Bill?
Yes.
Okay,
well, the third one down.
the third one down.
Read it, else.
Bill's gonna put it up on the screen too.
Oh,
There we go.
well, that is the third one down. I was looking at.
Okay.
Yeah.
So starting at the top, Business Technology Services had two different requests. One was related to module and Opus, which is used for human resource functions. There was a request for $50,000 that we are proposing based on this plan to be able to fund. There is lapse funding in BTS's fund that can help support that, so there would not be a general fund impact. This was supported by the BTS board at their budget workshop. The next one was also a BTS request for the Justice User Policy Board initiatives, and this is a pipeline of projects that they have in mind for FY20. We are not recommending to provide additional funding for that because based on the forecast they presented at that meeting, they have sufficient funding already to meet the current requests and also these requests in the following year in FY21. As we've talked about the past couple of years with a request similar to this, they're not spending as much money as they feel like they need for various reasons, mostly project delays. And as a result, they don't need additional money in order to be able to accomplish their objectives. So that's the reason there's no recommendation there.
Madam Chair, with regard to, to the BTS piece, Bill, do you know if they have looked out, because I've asked,
Jeff?
thank you. I just had a little mini vacation in my head there. I like that. I asked him, I mean, this is a lot of money right here, and I'm curious about whether or not they ever, for those projects that they're trying to get done, if it might not be less expensive for them to outsource it.
It is actually a combination of insourcing and outsourcing.
Oh.
So a majority of those funds would be used for outsourcing with a vendor to help support developing and implementing those changes and improvements.
I do think we have to be very careful about not accommodating their needs, though, given the little shade meeting that we had not too long ago about security and the cyber stuff and all of that. Just FYI. It's important to keep our finger on the pulse. Weren't you there, Commissioner Welch?
I was.
Commissioner Welch?
I
would you
was.
like to-
But you're saying they've got carryover or fund balance, or
He's already there.
they've got dollars to fund this?
They do. Actually, I brought a slide
talking
that
about
they
the
had
justice
presented
user
at that
policy?
board meeting
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
because that's what I wanted to bring up. So
that we can put on the screen here.
It says they were.
And as you can see here, FY20, they're indicating that their budget's gonna be $771,000. Their actual estimated spend is gonna be $474,000. That means that $300,000 carries over to FY21. They're asking for less than $300,000, so this tells me that there's funding available to support what they need in FY20. When it comes to next year's budget development process, we can look at this again, and if there are additional funding needs, we can address those at that time.
So it's not really not funded.
Correct.
It is funded.
It-
It's just
It's funded, but just from their existing,
Yeah, I
to
think
be-
that would be better, because I was panicked just for a split
as a
second.
justice board member.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it is being funded, but by their own reserves almost.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Kind of.
already budgeted.
The truth is, at this point, I don't know definitively, and they haven't been able to express to me definitively whether or not they are not spending as much because it's costing less than they estimated, or if they're not spending as much because of project delays. But under either circumstance, there's sufficient funding already within the BTS fund to support fully what they're asking for. And moving forward, based on the pace of the project, we can, during next year's budget development process, address that as needed.
I think there are reserves that they have there. They like to feel a little more nimble during the year as things come up, to have a little bit of cushion there.
And they do
So-
have that flexibility.
Yeah, for this particular one, but then once something else comes up, it'll have to be kind of a mid-year adjustment, perhaps.
It could be, and
Yeah.
that's certainly something we can look at together.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so moving on to CVB, we have Creative Pinellas with a couple of decision package requests. One is benefits for their employees. Currently, their full-time employees do not have health benefits, so they're proposing to be able to institute that. The next one, gallery program support and expansion. They have a gallery as part of the overall set of buildings that they're partially occupying. They want to be able to open that gallery on a year-round basis. So that's funding associated with that. And you may recall when we just talked about the user fees, there was a new user fee under real estate management to recoup their costs associated with opening that building on a continuing basis. So these two actually align together. So part of the cost that you see there is actually going to end up coming to the general fund because of the payment of those fees. So those two are things that both would fall under the TDT, the Tourist Development Tax, as far as a funding source. The Tourist Development Council did support funding those requests. And then the last one is something that would be a general fund obligation if it were supported, and that's expansion of an art summer camp grant program that they instituted this year. And the way that program works is they actually have the youths who are looking to go to summer camp select a summer camp they'd like to go to from a list that are considered to be eligible because they fall into the category of arts, and then they apply for a grant. If that grant is awarded, then Creative Pinellas pays that particular entity directly for that. It's a little bit of a change from the past where they were actually granting to those individual entities instead of doing it based on who the youths were that were actually selecting the camps. So there's a much broader universe of camps that are actually being represented and available, which is better from a geographic standpoint to be able to serve underserved youth. So the program is good. They had very high participation, they reported this year. They want to be able to expand it based on that. However, they have not had an opportunity as of yet to really explore fully potential sponsorships and potentially negotiating further for partnerships with those entities. So the recommendation or the proposal is to not fund additional funds from the general fund to support that, so that they have an opportunity to be able to explore that, and also if it's important enough for them to reprioritize their existing appropriation from the general fund to further support that program. So that's what that's about. As far as the CVB directly, there was the world's first airline monument and public art project. That's something that there was a request for $75,000 worth of funding. The airport here, St. Pete Clearwater Airport, had previously made a $10,000 commitment to that project. They've recently increased that commitment to $25,000. So that's where the $15,000 comes from, is the difference between 25 and 10. And that's why it says partially funded. The CVB, or the Tourist Development Council, did not support sponsoring this from the Visit St. Pete Clearwater budget. And Councilmember Gertis in St. Pete had expressed that he would go and seek other funding sources.
Madam Chair.
And he was very strong in his, Councilmember Gertis was very strong in his commitment to seek the funding.
He'll find it, I have no doubt. All right, I have another question, though, if I might. And it's back to the Creative Pinellas piece. Because I'm assuming you're working with them on creating their budget. Do you know one of the things that I remember really focusing on quite some time ago when they were applying for their 501c3 status so they could do their own, funding initiatives? Do you know where they are with that?
Yes,
And
they've
do
had the
they have a plan?
501c3 for some time.
Yeah,
And
but
then-
I know they've had it, but I guess I would like to know, what are they doing and what kinds of plans do they have in place to help relieve the kind of expansions that they might have on their 3 to 5 year strategic plan?
I can't
no
personally
longer
speak
on
to
the
that. I think
board.
that
Well, I don't know who is.
I think Barbara
I am.
Sinclair would need to speak to that.
Yeah, she'll be here.
Okay, well, okay, thank you.
Madam Chair?
Commissioner Welch.
Not
I
that
knew.
not that I'm filling your shoes after 3 months. But as part of our conversation going forward about the bed tax, and I think I mentioned it before, we want to have the discussion about what the county's strategy consensus is to support Creative Pinellas going forward. So we'll be talking about that issue whenever we have that conversation. If I've answered that question
No,
to the best of my ability.
that doesn't answer my question at all.
Well,
Well, they did the first fundraiser
yeah,
last
but
October. I think.
my point has been for a while, and we brought back comparisons of how other counties support the arts versus Pinellas, that the county needs to be doing more, not less.
I hear you,
So
but I
if the
think
question is, are they gonna fundraise themselves out of this issue and never come back and ask us for dollars? I don't think that's
no,
the
that's-
direction they're headed in.
that's not what I
But
was.
what they're doing in terms of independent fundraising, I don't have an answer for you today on that.
I know they had a fundraiser I attended, and it was quite successful, and I'm trying to remember when it was, but I know that they're planning on doing that on an annual basis, at least one major fundraiser. So I don't know when it is or what's in the works, but that was the original plans.
I
Commissioner
think
Gregg?
regarding that, I think the whole point of having the 501c3 was getting grants.
Right.
So I'm wondering what they're doing in that regard, but we'll see their budget
Yes.
later on in the process. I had a question about the airline monument. I don't understand what, so we're suggesting we fund 15,000
Pie.
even though TDC recommends against it? Is
The
that what we're
airport,
saying?
the airport has made a $25,000 sponsorship commitment to that, and that's what this is reflecting. The
Right, but the
proposal was to
TDC
use-
didn't want to fund it?
The proposal was using TDT funds, and yes, the TDC did not want to fund it.
Okay, so then it
There
would
was
not be
also-
coming out of CBB funds?
Correct, it is not.
It would be general funds?
No, it's coming out of
the
airport.
airport
Oh,
enterprise
airport
fund.
funds, okay,
Airport.
but that's, yeah, that's
Did they
not what it
say
says.
why?
Okay,
Did
I'm
they
sorry?
say why they didn't want to fund it?
Part of it was a question whether we could legally fund something like this. I know Michael was gonna, Zoss was gonna check into that. And then, I think the other concern by the TDC was, does this open the door up so that then we get into the public art world projects? And so, since Charlie was so strong and Gertis and his commitment to raising the funds, I mean, really strong, that they just kind of deferred to him, so.
Madam Chair.
okay, but that's not, okay, so this is wrong when it says the department or agency is the CBB, it's actually the airport.
The request was from the CBD.
No, I know, but,
So that's the reason it's
but the
characterized that way.
proposal, well, never mind.
I see your point,
What you're proposing is that the airport funds it,
correct.
okay. Never mind.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we do that conversation about arts and funding, and we have that, you talk about the comparison of other counties, wherever we get that data, we want to compare not only like the general fund or whatever, but also the fact that we're funding millions and millions of dollars in cultural art funding through the bed tax. So I want to make sure that we're doing an apples to apples kind of.
Yeah.
The last comparison we had the source included as well.
Okay, all right, that's what I want to make sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
On, back up to the arts summer camp. We're doing that this year, or Creative Pinellas is doing that this year. So
Yes, they are.
is the county funding that this year?
Yes, they are.
Out of general fund?
Yeah, it's part of the general fund appropriation that we provide to them in support, and they're using that for this program.
And that continues.
Yes, it does.
It's just not the expansion.
So it's an
This is
expansion.
This was an expansion of
Okay.
what they currently are doing.
Okay.
So, Madam Chair?
I was going to suggest that they, Creative Pinellas, look at talking to the Juvenile Welfare Board. I mean, this is an important program for our youngsters, and so it would be a logical place to have them apply for additional funding.
I like that idea, but I'd also like to know whether or not they've made any requests from the school board, because this is really about art and the importance of it in the education of a child, I would think the school board would be a partner here as well.
General funds.
We'll pass it on. It's a good idea.
For that committee really quick.
All right, so next, under CVB, the Gulf Coast Museum of Art Teaching Restaurant and Incubator. There's $100,000 to help support a study to look at the campus and determine what's the best use of that campus to include potentially this teaching restaurant and incubator concept. And this is something that was supported by the TDC.
Well, can I
This commission.
ask a question about that as well? I'm sorry. But has anybody talked with the folks at the St. Pete College on the Seminole campus? Because when they built that campus, part of the reason they built that huge commercial kitchen was to do exactly this kind of thing with a hospitality curriculum.
We have talked with them, met with them at the campus, and I actually, with Barry, looked through the proposed RFP. It is inclusive of the other partners, and, and it's stepped so that step one, there's like 3 different studies, but the first one just ascertains if it's a need to begin with. And then if it isn't, then it stops right there. So it's staged so that I think it's very well written and very appropriate to, very appropriately done.
And if I can, to the commission, there was also some other work done by some of the other partners on the campus. So this actually is a really good opportunity to kind of vet out all of the needs and look at it while we're looking at whether there's a need there at all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
So next up, security improvements at Florida Holocaust Museum. This was also supported by the TDC, and I think you're all familiar with the issue that they have there. The state put forward $500,000 toward this project as well in their state appropriation for their budget. This is a request that would actually, as we understand it, hit during this fiscal year. The TDC, or the CVB's budget, does have enough capacity in unanticipated revenue to be able to support that, and that's based on the fact that collections are higher than what the budget has been.
Great.
So next up, the Collaborative Behavioral Health Team. This is a grant that we've had for several years, and the grant has expired. It's a successful program that both county staff and our partners want to be able to continue to invest in, so that's reflecting fully funded. Drug court service level restoration. There was a request for $100,000, and taking CPI increases since 2009, that produces $40,000 to help get them a little bit closer to where they want to be able to get to. And the partial funding is similar to the strategies that we've used for several years now of incrementally increasing service levels. Homeless crisis response system front door. This is an approach that's consistent with programmatic strategies already in place. It's showing as being fully supported. The Florida Dream Center operational funding gap. This is something that was an FY19 request. It's documented here because it came through you all as a decision package request. But there has been funding identified to partially address this, and based on the work that we've done with the Florida Dream Center, they have another funding partner to support the other half of that funding that they needed. Need for Marchman beds, coordinated system of care for behavioral health, and central receiving facility. Those are all listed as deferred because we have a work session next week to be able to talk about what exactly we want to do strategically and policy-wise around this topic. And based on the results of that workshop and your input, we can determine what we want to do there. Going on to the next page, page 2. The competitive grant process, that's encompassing all of the decision package requests that are listed there, from STARS program, home delivered meals program for seniors, urban youth empowerment, Meals on Wheels, which is the same as the home delivered meals program for seniors, ACT workforce development proposal, SELF, I support youth, cultivating heritage and intellectual collaboration, and work readiness training Dream Center. So all of those are proposed to be part of that competitive grant process that we've talked about already.
But that's not something we're gonna be able to do next year. So what do we do?
I think that's, that was a good comment we heard today. We're gonna have to think about how we would bridge that, and let us come back to you with on that. If you're good with the concept, and then we address the funding level, you know, given the larger big picture, let us come back with a strategy, because that's a valid point.
I actually think 21 would allow you to get the model in place and implement it. I think October 1 is just too quick a turnaround, but I think it's
Yeah.
probably the right direction to go.
But then we only have enough to support a little more
Well,
than half of this anyway, so we better not fund all of this and
And
kind of negate the whole purpose of having a competitive.
that's kind of the issue of these have building blocks, and as you saw before, we just took on over $600,000 where we lost a grant, but we had momentum. Successful program, we
Right,
had
right.
momentum, we didn't want to pull that out. Some of these have current funding, others are new requests.
Right,
So we'd have to look at that appropriately if we're going to do that bridge, or maybe we do a half year, and, you know, or something. Let us kind of think about that and come back to you.
Right.
And that's again tracking back to the beginning of our work session today when Barry made the point that what we're looking for today is input. We're not looking for final decisions today. That input's going to help inform what you see in the proposed budget. So next up, we have a couple of requests for parks and conservation resources. First off, Florida Botanical Gardens Foundation, there was a $35,000 request, and that's actually something that is already able to be accommodated with the existing PCR budget. Next one was an additional spray tech for the department. That's something the department had an existing position that they were able to allocate and support that particular need. And then finally, the third one, increased PCR department staff. That's something that we have talked about internally, and we're working with PCR to establish performance measures and service levels, and we're going to use that to help inform what the right decisions are regarding staffing levels moving forward, because we don't have the data to back up an analysis that tells us what is the right resource level.
Yeah, and just to address that, I was concerned when I heard that we don't have enough staff to cover the parks, to have a staff person in every park when we're open. And I just think that's a safety issue, and it's a,
Security.
it's a, right. But I support the whole idea of having metrics and all that. I just don't want this to stall until we enter another recession. And they're dealing with 2006 staff and having to take cuts, even more cuts. So I'd hope that we'll put this on the front burner and just not let it lag, because I do think they're neglected.
Madam Chair, to Commissioner Karen,
I'm sorry, Commissioner Lyon.
to her point, I would just like to say, given the world that we are living in today, I would hate to see us dilly-dally on this issue and we have a horrible accident or unfortunate circumstance in one of our parks and there's no one there. That would not be good. So,
Well, don't we
And the
house,
other-
don't we house people on a
Well,
lot of our parks
some of them have
to provide
deputies.
after-hours security?
A couple, but
Yeah.
I think there's a much bigger issue in terms of staffing. When we look at our projections for the future, and we see that staffing is our single biggest cost. And so I think, you know, having metrics and looking at this strategically and maybe looking at how we operate a little differently is vital. Because when I got the first budget request from the department's report to me, and there was a lot of new positions,
Sure.
I had stopped, okay? And so I think we need to get real aggressive at looking at alternative ways of providing the same level of service, you know, at a cheaper cost, or at least addressing the increased need, you know, as program needs grow. Because it's simply not sustainable to add a position every time there's a new need or a new thought. You know, we've really got to think it strategically. I hear the concern.
Not new need, not new thought. It's
well-
old needs that have not been met. But,
But some of it was in other areas. So, you know, they're looking.
well, I know,
They're looking.
but the
yeah.
Parks Department in particular has lagged way behind. And I think if you look at the staffing from then to now, you know, it's pretty clear that we've beefed up staff in a lot of other areas, particularly technology, but not in parks, and that's our gem. you know,
I do understand that. I've
I
also
think they're doing
challenged,
wonderful things with what they have.
but I've also challenged, like in asset management, that we put a lot of positions on. I've challenged them to look to see if we need all of those and repurpose those to meet some of these higher priorities.
Make them park
So-
rangers.
Wherever that need is, right? So
Right.
if that's a
Okay.
priority, then let's switch the position out and put it where we need it.
Okay.
As long as they're not
Gotcha.
taking their computer into the
Right.
park.
Right. Yeah,
Can I,
those IT people.
Yes, Commissioner Welch.
I'm just gonna play the old man on the left here for the next year and a half. So, I appreciate what Barry said about looking at new ways of doing things, but I'm always recall that stat that we're at 1989 levels of employees. And my only point is, a lot of that has been done. Maybe Barry with a new set of eyes can find some more efficiencies, but I think in some areas code enforcement is another example. We never got to our targets in code enforcement. And I think in some of these areas, after Barry does all of his due diligence and make sure that we've got the technology and we're being efficient, we're not duplicating, we're not in silos, and he's found a lot of that already, that in some cases, we're just gonna have to add bodies because we've never replaced what we cut back to 1985, 1989 levels of staff. So,
But, you know, it's, and as the old woman up here,
you said that, not
Oh,
me.
hey,
not the oldest, but I remember I remember the recession and how painful it was for
Hey, we've been here too
everybody.
long now.
And for the 1,000 people that we laid off.
Yeah.
yeah.
And it was, I thought the sky was gonna fall down. I kept waiting for something really bad to happen, and it never did. I mean, we did survive, and I do worry about something looming in the future, and if we ramp back up literally, then we're gonna be it's gonna be very, very painful for the commission.
I certainly
I just-
support prudence.
And you probably remember
Yeah.
as
Oh.
mayor.
You too.
Yes,
Oh.
and you too, Commissioner Eggers.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
Yeah, I mean, the only thought that comes to mind is I remember one of those little line items in the city budget called street sweeping. And we really worked either with the county or the state on some of their areas and kind of took it over and were reimbursed some fees for that extra work that the city was doing. And maybe there's some opportunities to talk to our municipal partners that we have a county park in their city that they could maybe take on, and we could reimburse much lower than adding a person fully loaded. I mean, just things like that, I think that are out there that, again, we may have already done that, but I think it's something that,
We've done a lot of that. I think there's many more opportunities for things exactly like that.
That's why we have a new county administrator who
Right.
comes in with some experience in operations and can look at all of this. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
Okay, moving on. So, under planning and development, we have the housing trust fund, and we talked about that already and the approach there. Next, the 2020 census, that's listed as deferred. We're currently doing some research with peers, both on a local, regional, and statewide level to learn a little bit more about what strategies they're employing, what partnerships we may be able to employ, so that we can do this in a more holistic and partnership-based fashion. So while the perspective is an expectation that we will do something funding-wise, we want to make sure we understand what that looks like and what the funding needs are associated with that plan. Public defender, the crossover case managers, this is something that was set up as a pilot last year. They weren't able to start to implement that until partway through this year, so they don't have results to help support us determining, is this the right approach or not? Is there a different approach? Is it the right funding level? So the intent is to allow that to continue to build on its momentum and then reevaluate next year whether this just becomes recurring and doesn't need to keep coming back to you. North Pinellas Trail Loop completion. There was a funding request for a study associated with that. We already have the ability to be able to and are already doing pedestrian safety studies, including looking at those overpasses that are being described in that request. Anclote River turnaround. This one's one where the city has its own funding through the Penny for Pinellas to be able to support being able to do this type of project. It's an asset that is within their municipal boundaries, so that's the approach that we're looking at there. T-BARDA, that's one that we are proposing to fully fund. That's our portion of the budget that they have, so that's why that's represented there. Johns Pass Marina, that again, similar to the Anklet River turnaround, that's within municipal boundaries. That's a private marina. Both of them have the opportunity to be able to address that on their own, and we are working with the Army Corps of Engineers to see whether or not there's an opportunity to use sand accumulation that is causing this issue as part of beach nourishment moving forward. And we'll continue to work with the city to be able to identify creative solutions where we can help provide support without necessarily providing funding. Moving on to page 3. We have the reopening of the north end of Shell Key. That one's deferred because the study is still underway. So when that study is completed, we'll be able to take a look at that again.
Okay, wait a second, hold on, please. When that study is completed, that study has been going on for quite some time now. So is there an end in sight?
Yes, there is actually a study schedule, and I think it's.
Well, yeah, but it was supposed to be done by now.
No, it had a study schedule, and I think it's due in October.
I think it's October.
Here comes Kelly.
Oh, Kelly's here.
Kelly to the rescue.
Thank you.
We're here for a reason.
To hide in the corner. It's my favorite part over there. Plus I get to sit with the sheriff. So it's really nice. Kelly Levy, Division Director, Environmental Management. This is actually a different study. So we worked with, bless you, with the University of South Florida to look at a bunch of issues in that area. North Shell Key Pass was part of it, and it was a much broader scale study. This is a special study just specifically looking at North Shell Key Pass and Grand Canal. It's very quick, it's very rapid. We just kicked it off this spring. It's going to be done, draft report in September, final report in October. We are actually adding some additional tasks to the to Aptum as our firm, to their scope of work because of some of the information that's come out in the public meetings with the community. But right now, the plan is still to be done in draft in September, presentation back to the community, final in October.
So this is a different study than they were working on before, correct, with the Army Corps?
This is actually a county-funded study just specifically to look at options for Grand Canal and North Shell Key Pass and see what's available. The scope of work does include looking at alternatives, to reutilize that sand, to create an opening, to see what is necessary with regard to, Grand Canal. Could it close or will it stay open? It's just, there's a lot of questions. It's a kind of a moving target, and our consultant was very open with the community to let them know that this is not done. This system is still evolving, and, so we need to be prepared to understand that.
And then one last question, Madam Chair, if I may. The suggestion that has been made over and over and over again is to take the sand that's filling up that channel and use it to refurbish Upham Beach. Is that a possibility at all? Do you know?
Not for this project. So whenever we use a borrow source for sand material to go on any beach, it has to be permitted, has to go through the NEPA process. It's a lot of environmental regulations, permits that have to be obtained. It also has to meet what's called the state sand rule. And literally, we have to match the color of the sand and the grain size of the sand perfectly. And so it's a very, very complicated process there. But I did speak with the Army Corps this week specifically about that sand. We have Casa Grill coming up. They're going to start the investigations, permitting, and design for Casa Grill in FY20. And so they are going to include this area in that evaluation to see if there's any potential for utilizing that area as borrow.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Okay. Commissioner Peters, wait a second, Kelly.
So my question is, if the study's going to be done in October, and if there's recommendations that come out of that study in October, why would we not at least have a placeholder for some action? instead of otherwise you're kicking this can down the road for a whole nother year to put it in the 21 budget. Quite frankly, I don't want to listen to those residents all that long, to kick it down, because they just feel that we're kicking this can down the road and down the road and down the road and down the road. And so why would we not have some kind of placeholder based on the outcome of that study? Because this says, all right, we're going to get the study and we have a budget to do nothing.
Well, then, at that point, once we get the conclusion of the study, we have to come up with a funding plan. And so that funding plan could be core, could be assessment, could be, a number of issues. Our historical and our written policy is that we have primary responsibility for certain channels where our drainage responsibilities are, and then we do everything else by assessment. That's been our historical practice. So without presupposing what's going to come out of that study, I mean, we're going to have that conversation, but I don't know what we would plug in, because that would be a change in policy decision ahead of identifying what our responsibility is. So that's the reason we didn't do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right about having the policy discussion, because, we have several opportunities, or not, that are out there, and they all have different twists to them, that you can put a kind of paint the picture of it being really important, whatever. And I think, we kind of, as Bill was just flying through, and I didn't stop him at the one in Anclote River, which is, it is a dredge project that would need to be done in a timely basis. He said that the city has money, and they clearly have money, but it depends on what role we want to play with our state in helping fund something like this. So again, I get it, it's a policy discussion, but for me, when you talk about dredging, you talk about economic development, you talk about jobs, you talk about that raises it to another level in my mind, but then somebody else could say that their dredge project raises it to another level. So,
and you'd raised this issue about having a policy level discussion regarding these particular issues, and so getting some of these studies back and coming together and having that type of policy discussion in the fall would be an appropriate time, because they're complex, they have significant financial impacts, but every single one has made an argument about why we should be involved, and that's not a bad thing, but we really have to set and understand the total context of what we're being asked to support and have a consistent policy.
agreed.
All right, so wrapping it up, and last but certainly not least, because it represents 75% of what's represented here, is the sheriff's requests, and we reviewed that a little bit earlier. We have the law enforcement vehicles at $1.6 million a year for the next 4 years. You've got the 3 different items which are part of his recurring operating that have increased activity, as he described during his budget information session last month. Those being the electronic monitoring, jail pharmacy costs, and overtime for housing the federal inmates. That totals $3.5 million, and then $500,000 to be able to address collectively the rest of his requests, and that would be at his discretion to determine how that's best invested.
And so what this really represents is we're putting money forth of things that he is spending. He has no choice but to spend, and then providing $500,000 of things that he has at his discretion. That number could easily go to pick a number, because he has a lot of needs.
Right.
Now we're looking then at the cumulative impact of our decision and the growth of our budget, and that's how we approach this particular piece.
And that collectively leaves us at $7.5 million of proposed funding within the fiscal year 20 budget, based on what's mapped out here in terms of general fund impact. And tracking back to the slide that we showed, showing the forecast, that brings us slightly out of balance, but we do have time over the next couple of years to be able to correct and address that imbalance, and it's something that we feel comfortable that we can accommodate and continue to work moving forward. So wrapping up the presentation, going back to the slides, the last slide is just our next steps in the budget process. As I've mentioned a couple of times, July 23rd, we'll be bringing forward the proposed budget. Following that, on August 1st, we'll have a budget information session. At that time, we'll be looking for feedback regarding that proposed budget. And also, we need to, oops, sorry, thank you. Also on August 1st, we'll have to establish our maximum millage rates for inclusion in the trim notices, the truth and millage notices that are sent out by the property appraiser. That's statutory date that we need to do that by. And once we cross that date, we can lower the millage rates at any time up until the adoption of the budget, but we cannot raise it above that millage rate that we adopt as a maximum rate. On September 12th and 24th, those are our two budget public hearings in September. And then on October 1st, we would start fiscal year 20. And with that, I'd be happy to field any other questions.
Any questions? Yes, Commissioner Eggers?
Yeah, yesterday I was in a meeting and we were talking about the sheriff's commission, the Parkland Commission that he headed up, and a couple of the school board members made a comment about one of the issues that was identified was our 911 communication system and some of the shortcomings that our system has as it relates to having to do multiple communications. And I asked a certain person that question, and I said, that's something that's been talked about for some time. So I don't really have the question perfectly situated here, but I just wanted to make sure that piece of the puzzle has been addressed, and I'm sure it has, and where that sits, and is it in the budget anywhere? And I don't mean these decision packages, but anyway, that was something that I didn't realize, and maybe I just wasn't listening when it was brought up before, but the shortfall of our 911 system.
I'm not personally aware of that topic. I'm not sure if Lourdes is able to offer any insight on that.
Is that about the hiring issue?
It wasn't hiring, this was more about the technology that we have, and when a call comes in, what we have to do to get it to the right party, and it was part of the delay that they had in Broward getting. There's a lot of reasons for the delays in Broward, but that was one of them, and a comment was made, well, we have the same problem here. So anyway.
Lourdes Benedict,
Me
Assistant
neither.
County Administrator. I can tell you that we don't have all the same problems that Broward had
Thank
or
you.
has.
On this front?
On this particular
Okay.
issue.
Great.
I can have Jim come back, we can do a workshop on it, however you want to do it. But the sheriff is going to come speak on the report. But I can tell you, I was just down at the St. Pete PD at their new building and talked about this quite extensively with them. We do not have the problems that Broward has.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So I just want to
Yep.
help everyone feel confident with
Say
that.
it again.
We do not have the problems that Broward has.
But we are identifying any issues.
Yeah, we did
Okay.
identify some issues.
Okay, great.
And Jackie Weinreich from our radio and technology team has worked with the sheriff's office to make some of those improvements.
Okay, because that was said so emphatically at the meeting that I was like, well, maybe I missed something, but good, I'm glad to hear that we don't have the issues that they had, but.
You know, and there's been conversations of whether you want one piece app. You know, we have different ones. I can tell you ours is working well. It is not what they have in Broward.
Okay.
There you go.
And the other thing that they brought up was because I had asked them to, maybe they could bring the head of nursing at the school, health group at the school, to talk a little bit about how the nursing program that we added to is going. And there was some comments made that they feel pretty certain, and they didn't attribute it to the nursing increase, but this past year they were able to avert 7 to 10 suicides by some of the programs that have been instituted, whether it's there's a program from up north in one of the Connecticut issues that, shootings that occurred from before, Sandy Hook, I
Sandy
guess.
Hook, yep.
Some of
The
their
Sandy
things.
Hook
that they're-
Promise, they
Yeah,
have
the
that
Sandy
here.
Hook Promise.
Yep.
So there was a whole number of that, and so as I was asking about the nursing program, how far along are we, and how's that going, and maybe we could get some feedback from the nursing folks as to that mental health component that they're running into, because it really is between the students reacting and seeing things and reporting things and having somebody on the ground there. I just would like to get an update, see how that's going and how that mental health component might be being at least initially addressed. or
The
not?
sheriff is doing his presentation
Yep.
on the report, and I've also invited the school board, the person's in charge of that, Donna Sicilian.
Perfect. Yeah,
She's
she's-
not presenting, but if we need her to, she'd be
Great,
more than happy to do that.
perfect, thank you. That'd be super.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
are we at the end?
we're at the end.
Okay, I have one thing I would like to request. It's a little out of the context of our budget. But do you think it might be possible for us to have a bit of a shade meeting to discuss the issues that we are now having with Pasco County and the Albar Crossbar?
No.
No? Well, I'd like to just remind you, those of us that are going to FAC next week, we're going to be meeting those folks who signed that document that we received, and I'm pretty sure that there will be lots of discussion about it. Would be nice.
Talking about the taxation, the lawsuit and taxation. Barry, Jewel, and I had a discussion yesterday, and Jewel is planning on, I haven't sent the message yet to the Pasco commissioners, but Jewel is planning on talking to their county attorney next week at the FAC conference.
And to each commissioner individually
Individually.
regarding this issue.
It's, so you will be briefed so that you are aware of what everything is going on. So- I promise.
If we're at the, kind of at the end, I just didn't want, yesterday, I made a mistake on apparently, that I didn't realize how close we're getting. We're 18 months out from the election. There's 4 of us, I guess, that are up for election, and 3 of us that are not, and the request was made some time ago, like, be careful, don't get involved in races so that we don't, blow the opportunity to be on the canvassing board. And I really wanted to be involved in the canvassing board. And of course, yesterday there was one of those fundraisers that I had been on. Said, oh, sure, I'll be on your, host committee. And I thought, oh my God. So anyway, I called Jewel, and she said, yes, you did wrong. Nicely. She said it she said it very nicely, but I mean, it was all on me. But I asked her if she could just maybe give us a memo again to remind us what does and doesn't fall under, quote, endorsement, because it's not really an endorsement on our part, but it's legally one, I guess, as to how the court cases have come out. So just everybody be on your toes that they're coming, and sometimes I didn't think really on this one, so
And
my
I'll follow
apologies
up
to the
and-
board on that one, so.
I did have a good discussion with Commissioner Eggers yesterday, and I will follow up and send the information out to all of you and your assistants too, rather than go over it here. I'll also give
Yeah.
it to you in writing, so it's a resource that you have that you can go back and look at. Because there are some very specific do's and don'ts that have been
Yeah.
issued in opinions by the Division of Elections. So we do have very good guidance in that regard.
Yeah, thank you.
And, one thing I would point out, I know that you all are anticipating having a conversation about transit options and possible funding, and I will just mention that if you do choose to put a ballot question on during the 2020 election, then we would recommend that none of you serve on the canvassing board.
And that would be.
And we've been able to handle that appropriately before by appointing, former council member Herb Polson and former county commissioner Calvin Harris to the canvassing board when we had Amendment 1 on the ballot.
Henny, right? And green light and the
Green light,
Henny.
and so, but to that end, I also talked with Jewel about this issue yesterday, and I would just encourage us to, those who are not up for election, to consider that the canvassing board is very important
Yeah, well.
and very interesting.
Oh, it's great, and it was wonderful, and I was hoping, and then I just didn't even think about that. It's so early that you don't even equate things
I know.
now with 18 months from now, and the fact that there's no opposition or anything else is just, it's like, but it could happen 6 months from now or a year from now, and you will have made yourself ineligible, so.
And to give you all some perspective, there will be 3 countywide elections next year, because keep in mind, in March, there'll be the presidential preference primary, which you would not
That's
need to have a
considered
concern about. It is countywide,
Okay.
absolutely. It's,
Does
it's
it-
going to
that
be a
set the-
primary, but it will be countywide.
Is that, with the new legislation passed by the Florida legislature, does that equate to a general
No,
election then?
it does not. It does
That
not.
would be November.
It would need to be the November election, correct. So, but there is the presidential preference primary in March, which will see our municipal elections scheduled for spring of 2020 occur then as well. And then you have the primary in August and the general election in November.
Okay.
So 3 big elections next year.
All right. I have one other item to bring up. I'm not sure I have to necessarily have the answer today, but I'd like you to think about it. We have provided a computer for the media access for emails, and apparently it has not been used for a year now. And so they were asking whether we should remove it, that, you know, certainly anyone can get access to our emails through a request, but do you want to continue to provide a computer or not? And
Yes.
Well, they watch our meetings
Oh, yes.
online, so.
But this is to access our emails or
We're
other,
not required by law to have access in that manner.
Yeah, no, I don't think we need to keep doing
Is it only for media? Is it only for media?
well, really, I
For
think
anybody.
anybody could go in there and access emails if they wish.
It's back here?
I'm a yes, keep it, so.
I don't think we should.
I mean, I think we should, but I just wanted to ask you. I asked for how much it costs, but I don't have that answer yet. This just came up this morning.
It's probably a dinosaur. Does OTI maintain it or BTS?
It came from
Anybody know?
Okay.
Bill's got an answer.
BTS.
I'm sure that would be BTS that maintains it. And from a cost perspective, and we can talk to BTS about this, I would imagine that there is a way to be able to have that be able to be maintained without having a cost, because when they replace computers out, it doesn't mean that they're literally dead. I know that in OMB, we employ that approach when we need extra, laptop for someone to go out that doesn't have a laptop. We'll keep it for an extra year. It's out of warranty, but there's a little risk associated with it. So, and there's always plenty that are being cycled out. So I have a high level of confidence that from a cost perspective, just the hard cost of the computer, the PC, we can avoid that.
I think we keep it for
So-
another year.
My inclination is to keep it, but I wanted to ask.
Can I just put something else on as we're talking about this? I'm almost finished with the Mueller report. If you haven't read it, maybe you should. This is a huge concern when you have those kind of pieces of equipment for public officials, and anybody can get in and use it. Just an FYI, it is staggering, the information that's in that report.
All right,
A
we're going to
different
take a
world
lunch
we live
break
in today.
until 1 o'clock, and then we had scheduled at Public Records and Sunshine Law,
Two.
Sunshine Law training, so it should
Optional.
last no more than, what, an hour?
We've scheduled it for an hour.
Okay.
It is optional. It is something that we have designed for the 7 of you. And it would count as 1 hour towards your required 4,
And what time is it at?
whenever we would like to reconvene.
Oh, okay.
So I'd like to take a break for, where are we meeting?
In your conference
In the
room.
conference room. A break till 1 o'clock, and then we'll reconvene. We were actually scheduled to go to 5 o'clock today, so this is,
You're giving us a break.
I'm giving you a break. Okay, thank you. And thank you to the OMB staff and to all of our
Good job,
county
Bill.
staff. Good job.
I'll bring